The blizzard didn't care that she was a cop. It just kept burying her. 2 bullets, a frozen mountain, and a killer who knew exactly where Deputy Mara Vance was going, before she did. What happened inside Frostfang Pass that night wasn't an accident. It was an execution, planned by the man who ran this town, signed off by the man who owned it, and carried out by men who expected her to die quietly beneath 3 feet of Wyoming snow. They almost got what they wanted. Almost. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now. I promise you, the stories on this channel go places you won't see coming. Drop a comment below with your city and country. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. And if this hook already has your heart beating faster, hit like. Let's ride. The first thing you need to understand about Iron Creek, Wyoming, is that everybody knows everybody. And everybody has already decided who you are before you open your mouth. Population, 4,200. 1 diner, 1 hardware store, 1 sheriff's department with 7 deputies, 2 patrol trucks, a broken coffee maker that nobody fixed because fixing it would mean admitting they needed it, and an unspoken pecking order that had existed longer than anyone currently employed there could remember. Mara Vance had been at the bottom of that order for 11 months. She was 26. She'd graduated top of her class at the Wyoming Law Enforcement Academy. She'd scored highest in her cohort on the tactical decision-making exam, 3rd in the state on the written criminology assessment, and she could put 5 rounds inside a 2-inch grouping at 25 yards in under 4 seconds. None of that mattered in Iron Creek. What mattered was that she'd grown up in Cheyenne, not here. That she'd only been behind the badge for 11 months. That she was 138 pounds and stood 5'6" in her boots. That when she walked into the station each morning, Deputy Rick Stalls would look up from his desk, glance back down at whatever he was pretending to read, and say nothing. The silence was its own language. She'd learned to translate it. You don't belong here yet. Maybe not ever. Sheriff Graham Holt wasn't cruel about it. He was just careful, the way men who've been in charge for a long time get careful. He assigned her traffic stops and noise complaints, school crossing duty on Tuesday mornings. He'd smile at the briefings and say things like, "Good work on the Hendricks report, Vance," and she'd know, from the way he said it, that he'd barely read it. She'd stopped expecting a different kind of recognition around month 4. She'd started building her own case around month 7. What? It began with a truck. Black Pine Freight had been operating in the Iron Creek Valley for 3 years. Victor Rusk, the owner, was a square-jawed man in his mid-50s who wore Carhartt jackets and donated generously to the town's 4th of July celebration. He had a handshake firm enough to feel like a statement and a smile that arrived half a second too late to be real. The trucks ran late. That wasn't unusual. Freight logistics in mountain territory followed weather patterns, not 9-to-5 schedules. But Mara had started paying attention to which trucks ran late and where they went. She'd found the first anomaly in March. A delivery manifest logged a Black Pine truck arriving at a ranch supply warehouse on Route 9 at 11:15 p.m. But the warehouse owner, she'd confirmed it quietly, over the phone, under the pretense of a routine insurance inquiry, had told her his last delivery that week came in at 6 in the evening, 2 days earlier. The truck had gone somewhere else. She'd flagged it to Holt. He'd told her the manifest discrepancies were probably clerical. She'd asked if they should pull the GPS records. He told her she had a good instinct, but to focus on her assigned caseload. She'd kept a folder in her personal laptop at home. Nothing illegal about that. By November, the folder had 47 pages. Tire impressions photographed near a restricted access gate at the edge of Frostfang Pass. Fuel receipts suggesting vehicles were traveling well beyond logged destinations. One witness, old Ray Cutler, who ran a hunting lodge at the base of the pass, who'd mentioned over coffee she'd bought him at the diner that he heard engines up on the ridge at odd hours. Engines that didn't sound like snowmobiles or ATVs, sounded like something heavier, something deliberate. "You telling the sheriff about this?" Ray had asked. "I'm looking into it," she'd said. He'd given her a long look over his mug. "You be careful with that looking." She'd smiled like she didn't understand what he meant. She understood exactly what he meant. The morning of the ambush began unremarkably. November 14th. Sky the color of old iron. The kind of cold that arrived not as temperature but as pressure, like the air itself was pressing down, trying to flatten everything small. Mara had clocked in at 7, done her patrol loop through the valley, handled a fender bender on Birch Street involving two people who clearly despised each other long before the accident, and returned to the station by 11. Stalls was eating a sandwich at his desk and watching something on his phone with one earbud in. Deputy Keisha Torres, the only other person in the building who'd ever treated Mara like a colleague rather than an inconvenience, was out on a domestic welfare check in the north end of town. Holt's office door was closed. Through the glass, she could see him on the phone, leaning back in his chair, one hand over his eyes. Mara sat at her desk, pulled up the county GIS mapping system, and opened the land access files for Frostfang Pass, the restricted corridor. A maintenance access road, technically, county property, gated, decommissioned for civilian use after a rock slide in 2018, had made the first 2 miles of it unstable. The gate had a lock. The county had the key. So did the sheriff's department. So, apparently, did someone else. Because the photograph she was looking at, taken 3 days ago by a trail camera she'd mounted on a pine tree 50 yards from the gate, using her own money, on her own time. During a Saturday morning, she'd told her roommate she was going grocery shopping, showed fresh tire tracks passing through. Not just any tracks. She cross-referenced the tread pattern with the database she'd been building. Black Pine Freight, one of their mid-size cargo trucks, the kind rated for rough terrain. Mara sat very still for a moment. Then she looked at Holt's closed door. She thought about knocking. She ran through what she'd say. The trail camera got something. Black Pine went through the restricted access road. I think we need to send someone up there today. She thought about his face. Not dismissive, exactly. Cautious. The face of a man who would say, "Let's be thorough about this, Vance. Let me make some calls first." The face of a man who would make those calls, and by the time anything happened, whatever was up there would be gone. She thought about 47 pages. She thought about Ray Cutler saying, "You be careful with that looking." She clipped her radio to her belt, checked her sidearm, Glock 19, 15 rounds in the mag, 1 in the chamber, and pulled on her department-issued cold weather gear. She left a note on her desk, following a lead on the Black Pine inquiry. Frostfang Access Road, back by 1500. She didn't knock on Holt's door. She should have knocked on Holt's door. The access road was exactly as miserable as the photographs had suggested. Mara drove her department truck to the gate, found it unlocked, the chain hanging loose, no attempt to resecure it, and continued up the road on foot, unwilling to risk the sound of an engine echoing up the pass and announcing her arrival. The tracks were still visible. 2 sets going in, 2 sets coming back out. Heavy load on the way in, she could tell by the depth of the impressions in the compacted snow. Lighter on the way out. Something was dropped off up here. She followed the tracks for nearly a mile. The road switched back twice, climbed a ridge, and then dropped into a flat section she didn't have on her map. Or rather, the map showed it as collapsed terrain, impassable, which meant either the map was wrong or someone had done significant work up here that hadn't been reported to the county. The trees were dense on both sides. Engelmann spruce, mostly, the kind that grow slow and thick and keep their branches low, which meant the light came in at angles that played tricks, turning shadows into shapes, turning stillness into movement. Mara kept her hand near her weapon. Her radio crackled once. Static. She pressed the transmit button. Dispatch, Unit 7, radio check. Nothing. She tried again. Still nothing. The ridge. It happened up here. The mountains ate signals. She should turn around. She knew that. Protocol was clear. Loss of radio contact in a remote location, return to a position where communication could be reestablished. She kept walking. Because 20 yards ahead, through a gap in the trees, she could see something, a shape, something that wasn't spruce or snow or stone. She pushed through the branches. It was a structure, low, prefabricated, the kind of temporary shelter unit used in industrial work sites, bolted onto a concrete pad that looked recent. The door was padlocked, but the padlock was one of those combination types, cheap, the kind a decent set of bolt cutters would handle in 3 seconds. There were no windows, no visible signage, but there were tire ruts running alongside it and boot prints in the snow, and at the corner of the structure, a small surveillance camera mounted on a post, its lens aimed directly at the road she'd just walked up. Mara stopped. They know I'm here. She had time to reach for her radio, already knowing it was dead, and she had time to take 1 step backward, and then the first rifle shot came from the tree line to her left, and hit her in the shoulder and knocked her sideways off her feet and into the snow. The sound was enormous. Not the movie sound, the real sound, the one that's more concussive than anything, the one that punches the air before it reaches your ears. She was down. Snow in her face. Cold so immediate and total that for a moment she didn't feel pain, just pressure, the world rearranged. Get up. She got up. She moved before the second shot came, and she felt it go past her, felt it more than heard it, a displacement of air beside her cheek, close enough to be a breath. And she threw herself behind the nearest tree, a thick spruce, and pressed her back against it while her right shoulder screamed and her brain tried to process the situation faster than it had ever been asked to process anything. Rifle. At least one shooter, probably two based on the angle of that second shot. Elevated position in the tree line. They were using the structure as a choke point. They'd let her get close enough to see it, let the camera confirm her identity, then opened up. This wasn't warning fire. The first shot had been aimed to kill. She drew her sidearm with her left hand. Her right arm wasn't responding the way she needed it to. The shoulder, she didn't look at it. She couldn't look at it. 3 rounds to confirm position, then they'll move. She counted. 1 shot, 2 shots, 3 shots. Splintering wood 6 inches above her head. They were moving. She ran. Not back toward the road, that was what they expected. She ran perpendicular, cutting through the tree line, crashing through branches that slapped her face and tore at her jacket, and she could hear pursuit now, not shots, but footsteps. Someone crashing through snow behind her. The cold was inside her now. Her shoulder had graduated from pressure to pain, a deep, radiating, bone-level pain that turned every impact of her boots against the frozen ground into something she had to consciously push through. She ran for what felt like 4 minutes, but was probably 90 seconds. Then her legs went, not all at once. Gradually, a stumble, a catch, another stumble that didn't catch. She went down against a snow-covered pine and slid to the base of it, and her back was against the trunk, and her gun was still in her left hand, and she could see her own breath coming fast and ragged in the frozen air. She could also see blood. It was in the snow around her. More than she'd expected. The shoulder wound was serious. The bullet had gone through, she thought, based on the pain distribution and the blood pattern, but through what she wasn't certain and didn't want to be certain about right now. Stay conscious. Breathe. She pressed her back harder against the tree. Listened. The footsteps had stopped. The blizzard, the one that had been threatening all morning, chose that moment to arrive. The wind hit first, a wall of it, and then the snow followed, dense and sideways, the kind that reduces visibility to 20 feet inside of 3 minutes. Mara heard a voice somewhere in the trees, couldn't make out words. Then a second voice, farther away. They were searching. But the storm was erasing her tracks almost as fast as she was making them. She let her head fall back against the pine. The sky above her was gone. Just white. White over white. Over white. Her radio was dead. Her truck was a mile away. She was losing blood in a blizzard on a restricted road that her own department didn't know she'd gone up. You left a note. Yes. She had. And if anyone found it and came looking, they'd find her truck at the gate, her tracks leading in, and then nothing. The storm would handle the rest. She thought about Holt, about Stalls eating his sandwich, about Keisha Torres on the North End welfare check who had no idea where Mara was. She thought about how easy it had been to walk up here alone. She'd wanted to prove she could handle it herself. Congratulations, said some cold, precise part of her brain. You proved it. You found the structure. You confirmed the route. You have a bullet in your shoulder and no radio in a whiteout, and 2 armed men somewhere in the trees, and the nearest warm building is a mile away in the wrong direction. Real good work, Vance. She forced herself upright. Used the tree. Her legs held, barely. She needed to move. Standing still in this cold, with this blood loss and this temperature, she had maybe 30 minutes before hypothermia started making her decisions for her. She picked a direction and walked. Cole Mercer had been on the mountain for 2 hours before the storm hit. He'd known it was coming. He always knew, not because of some mystical sensitivity, but because he checked the forecast obsessively, the way people who've spent time in places where weather could kill them tend to do. The forecast had said the system would arrive around 1400. It arrived at 1147. That happened up here. The mountains made their own rules. He'd been planning to turn around at the ridge anyway. Ranger needed the exercise. The old dog was 9 years old and his hips gave him trouble on cold mornings, but he still needed to move, still craved it, still got agitated when 2 days passed without a real walk. Cole understood that. He got agitated too. Cole was 34. He'd come to Iron Creek 14 months ago with his 7-year-old daughter, Emma, and Ranger, and a duffel bag, and a job offer at the county land management office that he'd found in approximately 4 minutes of internet searching, specifically because it would put him somewhere with very few people and a lot of open country. That was the goal. Open country. Quiet. A life that was as close to ordinary as he could make it. He didn't talk much. He was polite but brief at the grocery store. He knew the names of his neighbors and kept them at a comfortable distance. He coached Emma's soccer team in the fall because Emma asked him to, and he couldn't say no to Emma, and he showed up on those Saturday mornings and stood on the sideline and clapped when the kids scored and said the right things to the other parents, and spent the drive home consciously letting the tension out of his shoulders. He was getting better at ordinary. Then Ranger stopped. The German Shepherd had been walking 3 paces ahead of Cole, which was his preferred position, not quite leading, not quite following, something in between that suggested mutual agreement about direction. He stopped with his whole body, not the gradual slowdown of a tired dog, but the full-body freeze of a working dog who'd been trained to freeze on contact with something that mattered. Cole stopped too. He'd learned, over 7 years of working with Ranger in environments where the dog's instincts had saved his life no fewer than 4 times, to stop when Ranger stopped. The shepherd's ears were forward, his nose was working. Cole could see the nostrils moving in rapid short cycles. His tail was low. Not tucked. Low. The posture of serious attention. Cole listened. Wind. Snow against spruce needles. Somewhere distant, the creak of a branch under ice load. And then something else. 2 sounds. Separated by maybe 4 seconds. Rifle shots. Ranger looked over his shoulder at Cole. It was the look that meant, "Do you hear that? Are we going?" Cole's jaw tightened. 14 months of ordinary. "Yeah," he said quietly. "We're going." Ranger moved. Cole found her blood first. A trail of it in the snow, already being covered by the storm, but still visible if you knew what you were looking for. And Cole knew exactly what he was looking for. He'd followed blood trails in 3 different countries under conditions considerably worse than this. He moved fast and quiet. Ranger stayed close, no longer ranging ahead. He'd dropped into the heel position, which meant he'd smelled something that required proximity. Cole found her 40 yards into the trees. She was upright, which surprised him. He'd expected down. She was moving, slowly, each step deliberate in the way that meant she was working hard just to make it happen. And her right arm was held tight against her body, and her jacket on that side was dark. He almost called out and stopped himself. Unknown situation. Unknown shooter status. Calling out announced position. He came around a tree to her right, her uninjured side, and kept his voice low and flat. "Don't shoot. I'm not with them." She spun. The gun was up in her left hand. She was left-handed, or she'd adapted, he couldn't tell yet, and her eyes were sharp even though her face was white and her breathing was wrong. "Who are you?" she said. Her voice was steadier than he expected. "My name is Cole. I heard shots. My dog found you." He didn't move his hands, kept them visible. "You're law enforcement?" She didn't lower the gun. "Deputy Mara Vance, Iron Creek Sheriff's Department." "How many shooters?" A pause. She recalibrated. He could see it happen, the shift from threat assessment to information sharing. 2, possibly. Rifle, elevated position, southeast of the structure. She glanced down at her shoulder without meaning to, then back up. "I'm losing blood." "I know. We need to move." "There's a cabin about 1 kilometer northwest, firewatch structure, probably abandoned but solid walls." He looked at Ranger, then back at her. "Can you walk?" "I'm walking right now." "Can you walk faster?" Something moved in her eyes. Pride, maybe. Or stubbornness. He recognized both. "Yes," she said. She lowered the gun. The kilometer took 22 minutes. Cole kept Ranger behind them, covering their trail. Not because a dog could actually cover a trail, but because Ranger would alert on pursuit before Cole's own senses caught it, and that 10-second warning could be the difference. He kept Mara on his left side, close enough to catch if she went down, far enough that she could move independently. She didn't complain. He noticed that. She made sounds, small, compressed sounds. When her boot broke through ice crust and jarred the shoulder. But she didn't stop and she didn't ask how much farther. He told her anyway. Every 5 minutes, 300 meters, 200 meters. Almost there. Not because she seemed to need the reassurance. He wasn't sure she did. But because in his experience, people with significant blood loss needed external anchors. Something to orient toward. The cabin materialized out of the white. Firewatch structure, probably 1970s construction. Log walls, metal roof, a covered porch that had partially collapsed on one side. The door was swollen in its frame. Cole hit it with his shoulder twice and it gave, and they were inside. Cold, dark. But no wind, and that alone was enormous. He sat Mara against the far wall, away from the windows, habit, and found the wood stove in the corner. There was dry wood stacked beside it, old but serviceable. Someone had been here recently enough to leave it stocked, or someone used this place for something and left it ready for themselves. He filed that thought. Got the fire going. Ranger went to Mara and pressed against her legs without being told, and she looked down at the dog with an expression Cole couldn't quite read. Surprise, maybe, or something more complicated. His name is Ranger, Cole said. I was pulling his pack apart, extracting the medical kit he always carried. Military habits. He'd stopped apologizing for them 14 months ago. Of course it is, Mara said. Her voice was fraying at the edges now. The adrenaline was leaving her. Cole crouched in front of her. I need to look at the shoulder. I need to reach my department. Your radio's dead up here. We both know that. He met her eyes. Shoulder first. Then we figure out comms. She held his gaze for a moment, testing something. Then she nodded and started working at her jacket zipper with her left hand. He helped her out of it without pulling on the right side. The blood was worse than her stoic face had suggested. The jacket had been containing some of it, and without the pressure, it moved. He worked fast and quiet. Exit wound in the back, through and through, cleanish, which was good. It had missed the subclavian, he thought, based on the blood pattern and her continued ability to be vertical and coherent. This is going to hurt, he said. It already hurts, she said. He packed the wound. She made no sound. He watched her jaw and her hands. Her left hand had a white-knuckled grip on her own knee, and her jaw was set hard enough to see the muscle working, but she made no sound. Tough, some part of him noted. Not performance tough, actual tough. When it was done, he sat back and looked at the work. Not perfect. He didn't have what he needed for perfect, but functional. It would hold for a few hours. You've done that before, Mara said. It wasn't a question. Once or twice, he said. She studied him. Her eyes were clearer now that the worst of the pain had peaked and leveled. You're not just a hiker. No. What are you? The fire was catching. Orange light moved across the cracked wooden walls. Outside, the storm hit the cabin like something with weight to it, testing the structure. Cole settled back on his heels. Right now, he said, I'm the person who got to you before they did. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Ranger, who was still pressed against her legs, steady as furniture. The structure I found, she said. They were using the restricted access road to run something up there. I've been building a case for months. Black Pine Freight, their trucks. The owner is Victor Rusk. She paused. Someone knew I was coming. The camera, Cole said. You saw it? I saw what you walked into. He was quiet for a moment. How many people at your department knew you were heading up here? Mara's expression shifted. Something careful moved across her face. I left a note, she said, on my desk. Who would have seen it? And anyone in the bullpen. She stopped. Stalls. Keisha was out. Holt was on the phone in his office. She stopped again. Holt. Cole didn't say anything. He's not... She started. Stopped. Started again. I've worked for him for 11 months. He's not... She closed her eyes briefly. I don't know what he is. The fire popped. Outside, the wind dropped for just a moment. One of those brief pauses that blizzards sometimes made, like taking a breath before the next assault. And in that silence, Ranger's head came up. Not the curious ear rotation of a dog hearing something interesting. The full-body stillness of a dog who had heard something that meant danger. Cole was on his feet before the dog finished the movement. I went to the window, staying to the side of it, not in front of it, reflex so old it wasn't even a decision, and looked through the gap in the boards. The storm had thinned slightly in the pause. Visibility maybe 40 feet. 40 feet was enough. Two figures moving through the trees toward the cabin. They were moving with purpose, not searching, tracking. Someone had found the blood trail, or the footprints, or they'd been watching the cabin all along because they knew this mountain better than Cole did. He turned back to Mara. She'd seen his face. She already had her gun in her left hand. "How many?" she asked. "Two," he said. "Same two, probably." She nodded slowly. Her face was pale, and her shoulder was bandaged with supplies from a stranger's hiking kit, and she was sitting on the floor of an abandoned cabin in the middle of a blizzard with no radio and no backup. She nodded like this was a problem she intended to solve. "Tell me you have a plan," she said. Cole looked at the door, looked at the window, looked at the layout of the cabin. Single room, stovepipe chimney, back wall with a storage alcove, front entrance with the busted porch, roof access through a hatch he'd clocked when they came in. 14 months of ordinary. "Working on it," he said. Ranger pressed his shoulder against Cole's leg. Outside, the footsteps got closer. Cole didn't move toward the door. That was the first thing Mara noticed. Most people, most untrained people, when they heard someone coming, they either froze or they moved toward the threat. Fight or flight, hardwired, predictable. Cole did neither. He stood very still in the center of the cabin and looked at the room the way she imagined architects looked at blueprints. Not seeing what was there, seeing what could be done with it. 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then he moved. "Get to the alcove," he said quietly. Not a whisper. Whispers carried in frozen air. Low and flat. The kind of voice that expected to be obeyed without explanation. "Stay low. Don't fire unless they're through the door and I'm down. I'm not hiding in a... You've got one functional arm and you've lost significant blood." He was already moving, pulling the wooden table toward the window, angling it. "I need you positioned where you can cover the entry point without exposing yourself. That's not hiding, that's tactics." Mara looked at him for exactly 1 second. Then she moved to the alcove. It was a storage cutout in the back wall, maybe 4 feet deep, shelves on both sides that had once held supply crates. Dark. Low ceiling. She pressed into it and got her back against the wall and her gun up, left-handed, elbow braced against the shelf edge. From here she had a direct sightline to the front door and the left window. Anything that came through either of those she'd see before it saw her. She hated that he was right. Cole did something she didn't expect. I went to the wood stove. The fire was going well now, throwing real heat, and he opened the stove door and used a piece of split wood to push 2 of the burning logs toward the front of the firebox, which increased the smoke output through the chimney pipe. Then he took his jacket and hung it on a nail near the right window, in a spot where it would be visible as a silhouette from outside if someone was looking through the gap in the boards. A shape that read as a person. A decoy. Then he went up. Through the ceiling hatch, smooth and fast and nearly silent. He gripped the frame, pulled, and was through it in one movement that suggested he'd done something similar more times than was comfortable to think about. The hatch eased back into place above him. Ranger stayed on the floor. The dog had gone completely still, positioned near the stove, his eyes on the door. Mara breathed. Outside, the footsteps stopped. Silence. 20 seconds of it. 30. Then a voice, muffled by the wind and the walls but audible. 2 sets of tracks into the porch, storms covering them fast. A second voice, closer. "Smoke from the chimney." Pause. "She's in there." Could be both of them. Doesn't matter. Rusk said, I know what Rusk said. Mara's hand tightened on the Glock. She focused on her breathing. In through the nose, 4 counts. Out through the mouth, 4 counts. Something her academy instructor had taught her for high-stress shooting situations that she'd practiced on paper targets and never believed she'd actually need. She needed it now. The door didn't open immediately. They were being careful, stacking to the side of it probably, doing this right. These weren't panicked amateurs. The way they'd moved through the trees, the way they'd communicated in short, clipped sentences, the way one of them had read the track evidence and made an accurate tactical assessment in under 30 seconds. These were men who'd done this before. She heard a boot on the porch, the creak of old boards. Then a sound from above, a soft impact, like something landing on the roof from outside. Cole had gone out through the roof hatch and come around. Mara understood the geometry of it before she understood what she was hearing. He'd created a situation where they were between two positions, and he'd done it without a weapon she'd seen him carrying. The door came in hard, not kicked. The frame was rotten and swollen, and whoever hit it with a shoulder, and it swung and bounced off the inner wall. And the first man came through fast and low with a rifle up, and his eyes went immediately to the jacket silhouette near the window. Something dropped from the ceiling hatch behind him. Cole came down onto the man's back, not from a great height, maybe 4 feet, but he had his forearm across the man's throat before they hit the floor, and his other hand on the rifle barrel, wrenching it sideways, and the shot that went off went into the floorboards, deafening in the enclosed space, and then the rifle was gone, and the man was making sounds that indicated he was losing the argument with Cole's forearm. The second man was still in the doorway. He had the smarter read on the situation. He didn't rush in. He pulled back to the door frame for cover and swung his rifle toward Cole on the floor. Mara shot him in the thigh. Left-handed, from the alcove, 40 degrees off-center, poor light. She didn't miss. The man went down in the doorway with a sound that wasn't a scream, but was close to one. Surprised pain. The kind that happens when the body receives news faster than the mind can process it. He grabbed his leg. The rifle skittered on the porch boards. Ranger was already moving. The dog crossed the cabin in 3 strides and was through the door and had the man's rifle arm in his mouth before the man had finished falling. The grip measured and precise. Not tearing, holding. The kind of controlled bite that said trained, not feral. Inside, Cole stood up from the first man. The man was breathing. He was conscious. He was not, however, in any condition to continue presenting problems. Cole had his wrists behind him and was using the man's own bootlaces, which he'd removed with a speed and efficiency that suggested this too was not the first time. Mara came out of the alcove. Her shoulder was screaming. The sound of the rifle discharge had left a ringing in both ears that she suspected was going to stay with her for a while. She stood over the man Cole was securing and looked at his face. She didn't recognize him, which meant something. If this was a local operation gone wrong, she might have expected a familiar face, someone from the valley, someone connected to Rusk through 6 degrees of small-town social proximity. This man was nobody she'd seen before. Late 30s, hard-featured, with the kind of flat eyes that came from doing things you'd made peace with and moved on from. "Professional," she said. "Yeah," Cole said. He didn't look up. "Rusk hired outside." Which means whoever's running this knew a local crew would have too many connections. He finished with the bootlace and stood. Someone with money and organization. Mara looked at the door. Ranger was holding the second man effectively immobile. The man was applying pressure to his leg with his free hand and doing his best to pretend the dog wasn't there, which wasn't working. "I need to get to a radio," she said. "There's one in the truck, mile back." "Can't make it in this storm." Cole was already looking around the cabin. He went to the shelves, swept them with his eyes, moved to the far wall, crouched, and pulled a wooden crate out from under the lowest shelf. Inside it, old emergency equipment, a flare kit, a hand-crank flashlight, and at the bottom, under a canvas tarp that had gone stiff with age and cold, a field radio. Mara stared at it. "Firewatch stations were stocked for isolation," Cole said. "The protocol was—" "I know the protocol." She moved to it, crouched beside it. Her right arm was useless, so she worked the casing with her left hand, checking the battery terminals. Corrosion on 2 of them. She scraped it with her thumbnail, slow work, irritating work, the kind of work that required patience she was finding hard to locate. Battery might be dead. Try it. She cranked the charge handle 12 times, the way the label instructed in faded print, and keyed the transmit button. Static. White noise. And under it, barely, the carrier frequency of the county emergency band. She pressed transmit. "This is Deputy Mara Vance, Iron Creek Sheriff's Department, badge number 20247. I am injured and requesting emergency response at—" She looked at Cole. "Frostfang Firewatch Cabin," he said. "Old Ridgeline Road, upper section, approximately 1.4 kilometers north of the restricted access gate." She repeated it, added, "2 suspects in custody, one with a gunshot wound to the leg requiring medical attention. I have a through-and-through gunshot wound to the right shoulder. Please confirm receipt." Static. Then, "Deputy Vance, this is dispatch. We have your position. Please repeat your—" The signal dropped, but it had gone through. She could tell by the response. Someone at dispatch had heard enough to start the clock. That was all she needed. She set the radio down and sat back against the wall. The warmth from the stove was reaching the alcove now. Ranger had released the second man and come to sit beside her, his big head dropping onto her knee without ceremony or preamble, like they'd known each other for years instead of 40 minutes. She put her left hand on the dog's head. Didn't say anything. Cole checked the two men, pat down, efficient, finding a second handgun, a knife, and a phone with a cracked screen that he pocketed without turning on. He pulled the rifle inside and cleared the chamber and set it against the wall out of reach of either prisoner. Then he sat down on the overturned supply crate across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The storm assaulted the cabin walls. The fire worked at its job. The two men on the floor were quiet in the way of people who'd recalculated their situation and found the numbers unfavorable. "Navy," Mara said. Cole looked at her. "The way you cleared the room, the bootlace thing, the way you came off that roof, you measured the drop before you went up there." She held his gaze. "Navy." He was quiet for a moment. "SEAL, past tense." "How past?" 14 months. She absorbed this. "You came to Iron Creek 14 months ago." "Yes." "Nobody knows." "I have a 7-year-old daughter and a retired working dog and a county land management job." He said it without edge. Just information. "I wasn't advertising." Mara thought about that. Thought about Cole Mercer showing up at the edge of town, quiet, polite, keeping to himself, coaching kids soccer because his daughter asked him to. The way people in Iron Creek probably looked at him and saw, divorced dad, nice enough, keeps to himself. Probably had some military background. There was always something, but nothing remarkable. Nothing to pay attention to. The same kind of dismissal she got. For different reasons, from different angles. But the same fundamental mistake. Looking at the surface and deciding the story was simple. "Your daughter," she said. "Emma?" Something moved in his face. "You know her?" "I know of her. Small town." She paused. "She's safe. She's at school today." Cole nodded. Once. The tension around his jaw, she hadn't realized it was there until it released. "Thank you for telling me," he said. Miles down the mountain, in the Iron Creek Sheriff's Department, the dispatch call came in at 12:43 p.m. Deputy Keisha Torres took it. She was back from the North End welfare check, still in her coat, still stamping snow off her boots. When the radio on the duty desk crackled and a voice came through in pieces, a woman's voice, flat and controlled, reading out badge numbers and coordinates with the particular measured cadence of someone who was conserving energy for the words that mattered. Keisha picked up the handset. "Dispatch receiving. Deputy Vance, repeat your position." But the signal was already gone. Keisha stood at the desk for 2 seconds with the handset in her hand. Then she went to Holt's door and knocked twice, fast, and opened it without waiting. Holt was on the phone. He looked up with the expression he used when people interrupted him, tolerant but pointed. He held up one finger. "It's Vance," Keisha said. "She's on the mountain. She's been shot." The tolerant expression left his face. He said something into the phone that Keisha didn't catch, and hung up. "Frostfang," Keisha continued, "Old Ridgeline Road, north of the restricted gate. She said she had 2 suspects in custody, through and through to the shoulder." She paused. "She left a note, Graham. On her desk. She went up there alone." Holt stood up from his chair. Keisha had worked for him for 6 years. She had seen him move quickly before, not often, but in the moments that required it, he moved like a man who remembered what urgency felt like. He moved that way now. He had his jacket off the hook and his keys in his hand before she finished the sentence. "Get EMS rolling," he said. "Call Bitterroot County for backup units. We'll need at least 2 more vehicles for that road. Get me everything we have on Black Pine Freight in the last 90 days. He stopped. "She mentioned Black Pine." "Not in the transmission," Keisha said, "but she left a note. It says she was following a lead on the Black Pine inquiry." Holt's expression was difficult to read. Not guilt. She'd looked for it and couldn't find it. Something closer to the look a man got when he realized he'd been moving too slowly on something and a price had been paid. "Pull the note," he said. "Don't touch anything on her desk." Keisha almost asked why. She stopped herself. There was something in the way he said it, "Don't touch anything," that suggested he was already thinking 2 steps ahead of the obvious response. "You think someone else saw it," she said. Holt looked at her for a moment. "Get EMS rolling," he said again, and he left. In the cabin, the man with the shot leg had started talking. Not much, not names. He was too careful for names, or too scared of the people whose names he might give. But he'd started making the noises of a man beginning to calculate his options, which was different from silence and worth paying attention to. "The structure up the road," Mara said. She was still sitting against the wall, still had her left hand on Ranger's head. Her voice was tired but even. "Who built it?" The man, she'd started thinking of him as leg wound since he hadn't offered anything else, looked at the floor. "I just moved cargo." "What cargo?" He said nothing. "You just tried to kill a law enforcement officer," she said. "In Wyoming. You know what the sentencing looks like for that? Federal charges because I was on duty. Attempted murder of a peace officer. You're looking at, I know what I'm looking at. Then you know talking to me right now, in this room, before lawyers and prosecutors get involved, is the best version of the conversation you're ever going to have about this." Legwound looked at his hands. The first man, the one Cole had taken down, was awake and silent and staring at the ceiling with the focused expression of someone choosing very deliberately not to speak or look at anyone. Whatever calculation he was running, he'd already completed it and locked the door. "Black Pine doesn't just move freight," Legwound said finally. His voice was low, almost reluctant, like the words were coming out against his preference. "The mountain route, the pass. There's a drop point up there that's been running for 8 months. "Running what?" He looked at Cole, then at Mara, then at the floor again. "Weapons," he said. "Crated. Moving through, not staying. The warehouse up there is just transit. They come in from the south, sit for 48 hours, go north." "To where?" "Above my pay grade." Mara looked at Cole. Cole was watching Legwound with an expression she was starting to recognize. Not skeptical exactly, but careful. Like he was running the man's body language against a separate internal database and checking for variants. "The order to come up here today," Cole said. "Who gave it?" Legwound hesitated. "Rusk," he said. "Victor Rusk." He called. Said a deputy had found the access road and needed to be handled before she reached the structure. "How did Rusk know she was coming?" Cole asked. The man was quiet. "Someone called him," Cole said. "Between the time Deputy Vance left the station and the time she got to the gate. That's a window of maybe 20 minutes. Who called Rusk?" Legwound's jaw worked. He was deciding something, and the decision was costing him. "I don't have a name," he said. "I've got a description. Older guy. Local. I heard Rusk talking to him on the phone once. Rusk called him." He stopped, shook his head. "He called him Warren." The cabin was quiet. Mara felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. Warren. She knew one Warren in Iron Creek. Mayor Warren Pike. She didn't say the name out loud. Not yet. She looked at Cole and found he was already looking at her, and something passed between them that was the wordless version of, "You heard that? I heard that. We're going to be careful with it." Because if it was true, if the mayor of Iron Creek had called Victor Rusk to warn him that a deputy was coming up the mountain, then the question wasn't just about a freight company moving weapons through a mountain pass. The question was how deep this went, and who else was inside it, and whether the people currently driving up this mountain to rescue her were entirely safe to trust. Holt had been on the phone when she left. His door had been closed. He'd been in his office, with a direct view of the bullpen, of her desk, of the note she'd left. She didn't want to think about that. She thought about it anyway. 11 months of being the rookie. 11 months of assignments that kept her close to town and away from anything substantive. 11 months of a sheriff who was careful and cautious and who had, every single time she'd raised the Black Pine question, found a reason to let it sit. Let's be thorough about this, Vance. Being thorough. Or buying time. She pressed her back harder against the wall. "Cole," she said. "Yeah." "When the sheriff gets here," she stopped, reorganized. "When responders get here, I need you to stay with me. Don't let anyone separate us before I can debrief you properly." He looked at her with the steady, unreadable attention she was becoming familiar with. "You think someone on the response is compromised?" I think I don't know yet, and I'd rather be wrong in a way that's embarrassing than right in a way that's fatal. Cole nodded slowly. My daughter, he said. Emma is in school, in town. This is a mountain operation. She met his eyes. She's fine. He nodded again, the same single motion, containing something he'd decided not to put into words because some things didn't require words. They just required the other person to understand that they existed. She understood. Helen Carver's veterinary clinic sat on the corner of Birch and 2nd, and it had been there for 31 years. And in those 31 years, Helen had seen most of what the Iron Creek Valley could produce in terms of animal hardship. She'd treated cattle and horses and working dogs and wild things brought in from the mountain, elk with infected wounds, deer with broken legs, a black bear cub once, its paw caught in an illegal trap. She was not easily startled, but she'd been sitting on something for 3 weeks that was starting to press against her conscience in the way that things did when you'd been reasonable about them for too long. It had started with a pronghorn antelope brought in by a rancher from the North Valley who'd found it moving wrong along his fence line. Helen had sedated the animal and found a fragment, small, misshapen, buried in the muscle of the hindquarters, too small to have been immediately disabling, but clearly the cause of the chronic lameness. Bullet fragment. She'd extracted it, cleaned the wound, released the animal back to the rancher. But she'd kept the fragment, put it in a small glass specimen jar and set it on the corner of her desk where it had stayed while she decided what to do about it. Then the rancher came back. Different rancher, Ed Svensson, whose property was 3 miles east. He'd found 2 mule deer near his property boundary, both dead, both with wounds she'd recognized before he finished describing them. She'd gone out to see them. Both had been shot. Not hunters, wrong season, and wrong location for licensed hunting, and the wound angles were wrong for any kind of legal hunting scenario. Both had been shot and left, not targeted for population management, not removed, shot in passing, collateral. Something was moving through that corridor with weapons that were discharging, whether deliberately or accidentally, into the wildlife on either side of the path. She'd pulled the fragments from both deer, compared them under magnification with the first specimen jar. Same construction, same ballistic profile, as far as she could determine without being a forensic specialist, which she was not. But her grandson was studying criminal justice at the University of Wyoming. His name was Davis. He was 20 years old and home for the long Thanksgiving weekend, and he'd been sitting at her kitchen table eating leftover chili when she'd told him what she had. He'd looked at the jars. He'd asked her several questions that were more precise than she'd expected, about the fragment's size and shape and the estimated caliber. Graham, he'd said, can you tell me where these deer were found, the exact locations? She'd shown him on a map. He'd been quiet for a moment. Then he'd said, there's a road up there. Black Pine Freight has been using it. I've seen their trucks. One of my buddy's dad drives for them, and he told me they run up toward the pass at night sometimes. Helen had looked at her grandson across the kitchen table. There's a gate, she'd said. Yeah. He'd looked at the map again. Graham, I think I should take some pictures. She told him to be careful. She told him several times to be careful. She told him that if he went anywhere near that road, he was not to go alone, and he was not to go after dark, and he was absolutely not to let anyone see him. Davis had said yes, yes, and yes. She was still waiting to find out which of those he'd actually meant. What she didn't know, sitting in her clinic that afternoon, watching the blizzard hit Birch Street and covering her specimen jars with a cloth out of a habit she couldn't quite explain, was that Davis had already gone. 3 days ago, Saturday morning. He'd driven out early, parked on the county road 200 yards below the gate, hiked in on foot along the tree line where he'd been less visible, and spent 40 minutes photographing from cover. The photographs were on his phone. He hadn't told his grandmother yet because he was still figuring out what exactly he'd gotten. One image in particular was sitting at the top of his camera roll, and it was the kind of image that, once you understood what you were looking at, you couldn't un-understand. A Black Pine freight truck, side panel partially slid open. The driver had been careless or comfortable or certain there was no one watching, with crates visible inside. And from one of the crates, where the lid had been improperly secured and had shifted in transit, a cascade of brass cartridges catching the thin morning light, identical in profile to the fragments in his grandmother's specimen jars. Davis Carver sat in his grandmother's guest room with his phone face down on the bed beside him, listening to the blizzard and trying to decide who in this town he could trust with what he had. He hadn't come up with a satisfying answer yet. Outside, the wind picked up. The town of Iron Creek pressed down under the weight of the storm, and somewhere up on Frostfang Pass, the sound of Sheriff Graham Holt's truck climbing the restricted access road was swallowed by snow before it reached anyone. And in the cabin, Ranger's ears moved toward the window. The dog stood. Not in alarm, not the rigid freeze of the threat posture. Something else. Something that said, familiar sound. Something known. A vehicle. Climbing. Mara heard it too. So did Cole. The two men on the floor heard it. Everyone waited. Blue and red light pulsed through the gap in the window boards, fragmentary through the driving snow. Then a voice from outside, amplified slightly by the cold, carrying the particular quality of someone who'd been afraid and was trying not to let it show. "Vance, Deputy Vance, it's Holt, we're coming in." Mara looked at Cole. Cole looked at the door. Neither of them moved for one full second. Then Mara said, quietly enough that it wouldn't carry through the walls, "Stay close." "Already planned on it," Cole said. The door opened and Graham Holt came in out of the white. Holt came in with snow on his shoulders and his hand on his holster and his eyes moving around the room in the fast, cataloging way of a man who'd spent enough years in law enforcement that threat assessment had become involuntary, like breathing. He took in the cabin in under 4 seconds. The fire. The two men on the floor, one with a bootlace binding and the expression of a locked door, one with a makeshift pressure bandage on his thigh, and the expression of a man who'd said more than he'd planned to. The rifle propped against the wall. Ranger standing between the stove and the alcove, watching the door. Cole, positioned to the left of the entry point, not in the obvious spot, not in the place someone would stand if they were simply waiting to be rescued. And Mara, against the back wall, her right arm immobilized and her face the color of old ash, her left hand still holding the Glock with the barrel pointed at the floor. Holt's hand came off the holster. "Jesus, Vance," he said. "Sheriff?" Her voice was level, not warm. He crossed to her, crouched, looked at the shoulder. His face did something complicated, something that moved through relief and landed somewhere closer to guilt, and stayed there. "EMS is right behind me, 2 minutes out." "I know." He looked at the two men, looked at the rifle, looked at Cole, who hadn't moved or spoken. "Who's this?" Holt asked. "Cole Mercer," Mara said. "He found me. He kept me alive." Holt stood and extended his hand to Cole. Cole shook it, brief, measured. "You're the land management guy," Holt said. "Live over on Cutler Road." "That's right." "Hell of a coincidence, you being up here." "I was hiking with my dog," Cole said. "He heard the shots." Holt looked at Ranger. Ranger looked back at Holt with the calm, unimpressed assessment of an animal that had learned to read people and was currently reading one. "You do any kind of tactical training?" Holt asked. He was looking at the bootlaces on the first prisoner. "Some," Cole said. Holt let that sit for a moment. He was smart enough to know when he wasn't getting the full version of something. He was also, in this moment, facing a room that told a story. 2 armed men neutralized, 1 shot, 1 restrained, a deputy alive who by all physical evidence should not have been. And the full version of something could wait until everyone was off the mountain. The EMS crew came through the door 40 seconds later. 2 of them, a man and a woman, moving efficiently. And Mara felt the particular surrender of handing her body over to people whose job it was to manage it. She let them. She kept her eyes on the room. Holt was on his radio, calling in the suspect's situation, requesting additional transport units. His second deputy, Torres, had come up in a separate vehicle and was now crouching beside Leg Wound, who was watching the EMS crew work on Mara with the expression of a man who had entirely recalculated the trajectory of his afternoon. Torres caught Mara's eye across the room. She didn't say anything. She just held the look for a moment. A look that said, "I heard your transmission. I'm here. I've got you." It was the most Mara had felt seen in 11 months. She looked away before she did something embarrassing with her face. Cole stayed close, exactly as he'd said he would. When the EMS crew moved to load Mara onto the portable stretcher, he positioned himself at the edge of the porch, not in the way, not demanding anything, just present, in that particular way he had of being present, taking up space without announcing it, watching without appearing to watch. Holt noticed. Cole registered that Holt noticed. On the drive down the mountain, Cole following in his own truck, the EMS vehicle ahead, Holt's cruiser behind, the storm had begun to thin slightly. Not clearing, just lifting the ceiling enough that the ridge lines became visible again, dark against the white, and the road that had been invisible at 20 feet opened up to something navigable. Cole drove with both hands on the wheel and Ranger on the back seat and his mind running through the shape of what he knew. The name Warren. The phone call Rusk had made to someone local, someone the hired man had heard addressed as Warren. The restricted access road, the structure on the ridge, 8 months of operation, weapons moving north through the pass. And Holt. The question of Holt. He didn't know. That was the honest position. He'd looked at the man's face when he came through the cabin door, and he'd looked for the thing you looked for, the microtells of someone who expected to find something different from what they found, someone whose plan had been disrupted. He hadn't found it. What he'd found was a man who looked genuinely shaken, which was either real or very good performance. Cole had met very good performers, in places where the cost of misreading them was immediate and irreversible. He didn't reach a conclusion. He held the question open and drove. Iron Creek General was 32 beds and an ER that got overwhelmed whenever a ski season injury ran bad, and the big Bitterroot County Hospital was backed up. It was staffed by people who knew their limitations and worked hard inside them, and the trauma surgeon who met the EMS crew at the bay doors was a small, precise woman named Dr. Alicia Reeves, who had trained in Denver and come back to the valley for reasons she'd never fully explained to anyone's satisfaction. She looked at Mara's shoulder, asked 3 fast questions, and wheeled her through the doors. Cole stood in the parking lot for a moment. Snow on his jacket, Ranger at his side. Holt was parking his cruiser. He got out and walked toward Cole with his hands in his jacket pockets and his breath making clouds in the cold air. "She stable?" Cole asked. "Dr. Reeves thinks so." Holt stopped a few feet away. He looked tired in the specific way of men who'd been running on adrenaline and had just felt it leave. Through and through, like she said. No arterial involvement, or she wouldn't have made it 2 hours on the mountain. Cole nodded. Holt looked at him for a moment. "You want to tell me what your actual background is?" "Not particularly. I'm asking officially. Am I being detained?" Holt's jaw tightened slightly, then released. He almost smiled, not quite. "No. You're a witness and a good Samaritan, and I owe you more than I can probably say right now." He paused. "But I'm going to need a full statement." "I know." Cole looked toward the ER doors. "Give me an hour. I need to call my daughter's school." Holt nodded. He turned to go and then stopped. "The 2 men she had in that cabin," he said. He didn't turn around. "She got anything out of them?" Cole considered, ran the variables. "You should ask her," he said. Holt stood there for another second. Then he walked back toward the building. Emma Mercer was 7 years old and had her father's eyes and her mother's stubbornness and a quality of stillness that her teachers found either remarkable or unnerving depending on their own temperament. She was in 2nd grade at Iron Creek Elementary, which was a 12-minute drive from the hospital, and she was currently in the middle of a reading exercise when the school secretary came to the classroom door and spoke quietly to Mrs. Patterson. And Mrs. Patterson looked at Emma with an expression that Emma had learned to read as your dad called. He called once a week at this time, to check. He'd been doing it since they moved here, and he'd done it before that too, in the apartment in Virginia, after he came back and before they left, calling from wherever he was in the building to check that she was where she was supposed to be. Emma had asked him once why he did it. He'd said, "Because I like knowing." She'd accepted this. She'd been 5 then. Now she accepted the note Mrs. Patterson handed her. Dad called, "You're fine, he'll be at pickup," and read it twice and put it in her desk and went back to her reading exercise. The girl next to her, whose name was Clara, leaned over and whispered, "Is everything okay?" "Yes," Emma said. She believed it, because her father had called, which meant he was fine, which was the only variable she actually tracked. What she didn't know, what she would piece together much later, in the patient and systematic way she did most things, was that her father had made that call from a hospital parking lot with snow on his jacket and dried blood on his hands that wasn't his own, and that the simple fact of his voice on that school phone line had been the first moment in 4 hours that he'd let himself be afraid of anything. Mara came out of surgery 3 hours later. The bullet had done what through-and-throughs did when they were being relatively merciful. It had passed through the deltoid and the upper trapezius without touching the subclavian artery or the brachial plexus nerve cluster, both of which would have created problems of a significantly different magnitude. Dr. Reeves used the word lucky twice, each time with an inflection that suggested she found the word inadequate but couldn't locate a better one. Mara lay in the recovery bed and looked at the ceiling and felt the particular weight of a body that had been through something and was processing the bill. Torres was in the chair beside the bed when Mara's eyes focused. "Hey," Torres said. "Hey." Mara's voice came out rough. "Anesthesia. Don't try to move the arm." "I wasn't." She looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Holt?" "Outside. He's been in and out." Torres paused. "He looks rough, Mara." "Rough how?" "Like a man who's been running something in his head for a few hours and doesn't like where it keeps going." Torres leaned forward, elbows on knees, voice lower. He pulled Black Pines County records the minute he got back to the building. Full access request. He called the state DA's office from the parking lot before he even came inside. Mara turned her head to look at Torres. "He called the DA. 20 minutes after he got back. I heard him on the phone." Mara held that. The state DA's office. Not the county prosecutor, the state level, which suggested he was creating a record that existed outside of any local chain of custody, which was either the move of a man who was clean and understood that this situation required that kind of protection, or the move of a man who was very smart about managing his exposure. "The men in the cabin," Mara said. "Where are they?" "Bitterroot County lockup. Holt had them transferred within an hour, said he didn't want them in our facility given the circumstances. Keisha drove the one with the leg." Torres paused. "The leg wound is clean. The bullet went through soft tissue. He's going to be fine, which means he's going to be available to talk." "He already talked." Mara shifted against the pillow, regretted it. "He gave me a name." Torres waited. "Warren," Mara said. Torres's face went very still. "He said Rusk called someone named Warren, local, someone with enough standing to call Rusk directly and have Rusk listen." Mara watched Torres's face. "One Warren in Iron Creek with that profile." "Mayor Pike," Torres said, barely above a whisper. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to." Mara looked at the ceiling again. "I need Cole Mercer in this room." "The guy from the mountain?" "He's got information, and I need him debriefed before anyone else gets to him." Torres stood up. "Holt's going to want to do the debrief himself." "I know." Mara looked at her. "I want you in the room when it happens." Torres held her gaze for a moment, reading the request for what it was, not paranoia, not interdepartmental politics. A deputy who'd been shot on a mountain by men who knew she was coming, laying out a specific request about who she trusted to be in the room. "I'll get him," Torres said. "What?" "Cole came in with Ranger because nobody at the nurse's station wanted to be the person who told a 9-year-old German Shepherd he couldn't go through a door that his person was walking through." He sat in the other chair and looked at Mara, and she looked at him, and they shared a moment of the specific recognition that people who've been through something difficult together carry with them. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of mutual accounting. "We were there. We know what that was." "Your shoulder?" he said. "Clean. I'll live." She looked at Torres by the door. "I'm going to tell you what I told Torres, and then we need to make a decision about how we move forward." Cole said nothing. Ranger settled under the chair. She told him about the name, about Warren Pike, about Holt calling the state DA. Cole listened without expression. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The DA call," he said. "What do you read on that?" "I'm still reading it. Best case, he's protecting the investigation from local interference." He paused. "Worst case, he's establishing a relationship with the DA before someone else does, controlling the narrative from the front end." "Yes." "You don't know which?" "No." He nodded. "What do you need from me?" "Your statement. Everything you saw from the time Ranger led you toward the shots until Holt came through the cabin door. Every word the man with the leg said. Every word." She looked at him steadily. "And I need you to give it to Torres, not Holt. Right now, before the formal debrief." Torres looked up from the door. Cole looked at Torres, then at Mara. "You're creating a parallel record." I'm creating a record that doesn't run exclusively through my department's chain of command until I know that chain is clean. That's going to make Holt difficult. Holt can be difficult. Her voice was flat. Someone in my chain of command called Victor Rusk and told him I was driving up that mountain. I'd like to be certain about who before I hand everything I have to the man sitting outside the door. Cole was quiet for a long moment. All right, he said. He looked at Torres. You got something to write on? The statement took 40 minutes. Cole was methodical about it in a way that surprised Torres, not the loose, chronological, memory as it comes recounting she got from most civilian witnesses, but a structured account that moved from observable facts to inferences and kept them cleanly separated. Times, distances, physical descriptions, exact wording of what the prisoners had said in the cabin. When he finished, she had 6 pages in her notebook and the distinct, unsettling feeling that the man sitting across from her had written reports before. She didn't ask. He didn't volunteer. When Holt came in 20 minutes later, he looked at the notebook in Torres's hand and at Cole in the chair and at Mara in the bed, and he did the math that the math demanded. Keisha, he said. His voice was measured. You want to tell me what's in the notebook? Mr. Mercer's preliminary witness statement, Torres said. Deputy Vance asked me to take it while she was still able to confirm details. Holt looked at Mara. Mara looked back at him. Something passed between them that wasn't quite accusation and wasn't quite denial, something that occupied the difficult space between 11 months of working relationship and a bullet hole and a name she wasn't ready to say out loud in his presence. Graham, she said, I need to ask you something directly. All right. The phone call you were on when I left. Who were you talking to? The room was very quiet. Holt's face did several things in fast sequence. A flash of something that might have been surprise, and then something harder beneath it, and then a kind of deliberate stillness that was different from guilt and different from innocence, and was the face of a man choosing his next words with the understanding that they mattered. Merrick, he said. Bill Merrick, State DA's office. I've been talking to him on and off for 6 weeks. Mara didn't react. About Blackpine. About Blackpine. Holt moved to the end of the bed. Not threatening, just standing, occupying the room like a man who'd decided he was done being careful about optics. I've known about the freight anomalies since September. I've been building a parallel track with the state DA because I had reason to believe the local operation was compromised. Torres spoke first. What reason? Holt looked at her. 3 weeks ago, I received an anonymous tip. Phone call, disposable number, never traced. The caller said Blackpine was moving weapons through the pass with protection from inside Iron Creek's town government. He paused. I didn't go to the county because the caller specifically said the county was part of it. I went to the state. Mara looked at him for a long time. You didn't tell me, she said. You were a 26-year-old deputy with 11 months on the job. He said it without apology, but also, she thought, without the dismissal it would have carried 3 months ago. Something in the phrasing was different. Not just a rookie, but a consideration he'd made. A calculation. If you started poking at Blackpine independently, it would alert whoever was watching. I needed you clear of it. Someone watched anyway, she said, and when I poked, they shot me. I know. His voice was tight. Mara, I know. It was the first time he'd used her first name in 11 months of employment. She felt something shift in the room's temperature. Not warmth. More like the specific feeling of a picture coming into focus. Still incomplete. Still uncertain in places, but oriented differently than it had been. Who in town government, Torres said. She was still holding the notebook. The anonymous tip. Did they name anyone? Holt looked at her, then at Mara. The tip mentioned a name, he said carefully. I haven't confirmed it. I'm not going to say it in this room until I have confirmation. Pike, Mara said. Holt's eyes went to her fast. Stayed. She watched his face. She was watching for the involuntary responses, the things training couldn't fully control, the micro-expressions that moved in the half-second before the managed version of a face asserted itself. What she saw was not the flash of someone caught. It was the flash of someone who'd been carrying something alone and had just had it named by someone else. Relief, fractional, contained, but she saw it. How? Holt said, just that. One of the men in the cabin, he'd heard Rusk on the phone. She held Holt's gaze. The tip you got, was it enough to move on? Without corroborating evidence. Pike has resources. If we moved on a tip from an anonymous caller and it didn't hold up in court, we'd lose everything and he'd know we were looking. Holt sat down in the chair Torres had vacated, the first time she'd ever seen him sit in a patient's room. Merrick told me he needed something physical, something connecting Pike to Rusk's operation directly. Mara thought of Davis Carver. She didn't know Davis Carver existed, but the pieces around the edges of what she knew, Helen's ballistic fragments, the wildlife evidence, the freight route, were accumulating into a shape that wanted more evidence at its center. Then we get it, she said. Holt looked at her, at the bandaged shoulder, at the IV line running into her left arm, at the color of her face, which was still wrong. You're in a hospital bed. I'm aware of that. You just had surgery. Also aware. Graham. She said his name back to him with the same weight he'd given hers. Someone in this town gave an order to have me killed. Not scared off. Not warned. Killed. She let that sit for exactly 1 second. The only thing I'm planning to do from this bed is make sure that when the next part of this happens, it happens right. Holt looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Cole, who hadn't spoken in several minutes, and who was sitting in the corner with his elbows on his knees and his eyes on the floor, very still, in the way of someone who was listening to everything and calculating something specific. Mr. Mercer, Holt said. Cole looked up. You have any reason to stay involved in this after today? Cole was quiet for a moment. The men who came into the cabin, he said. They weren't sent to scare her. They were sent to confirm she was dead and then go back down the mountain. He paused. They know she's not dead now. They know she transmitted before they reached her. They know at least 2 additional people have information. He looked at Holt evenly. My daughter takes the bus from school to the after-school program on Maple. Same route, same time, every day. The room was quiet. I have reason to stay involved, Cole said, upset. The call that changed everything came at 4:17 p.m. Holt's phone. He stepped into the hall to take it and came back 60 seconds later with an expression Mara had never seen on him. Not shock exactly. More like the face of someone who'd been waiting for a specific piece of information and had just received it and now needed to absorb the weight of what it confirmed. That was Merrick, he said, State DA. He looked at Mara. Bitterroot County processed the 2 men from the cabin. Standard intake, photographs, prints, property inventory. He paused. The phone Cole took off the first man. Bitterroot ran it. It's a burner, but it's not as clean as they thought. There are 4 calls in the log. 3 to an unregistered number we're tracing, and 1, he stopped. Graham, Mara said. 1 incoming call at 11:53 this morning, Holt said. 11 minutes after your note was visible on your desk. From a number registered to the Iron Creek municipal offices. He paused. Specifically, to the extension of the mayor's personal assistant. The room held that. Torres exhaled slowly. Cole looked at the floor. Mara lay in the hospital bed with a hole in her shoulder and 11 months of being handled carefully and kept at the periphery of things, and she felt something consolidate inside her that had been forming for a long time. Something that wasn't anger exactly, or satisfaction, but something between them that felt harder and more useful than either. How long to get a warrant, she said. Holt's jaw set. Merrick's already drafting. Pike's office, Black Pine's warehouses, both. Yes. Tonight? He looked at her. The look that said, you've been shot and you're in a hospital bed and it's already past 4 in the afternoon. The look she knew was coming. The look she'd been receiving in various forms for 11 months. I'm not going anywhere, she said, before he could use it. I just need to know the timeline. Holt stood up from the chair. He straightened his jacket. Something in the movement was deliberate, the motion of a man returning himself to the mode that was required of him now, which was not the mode of someone sitting in a hospital room trying to manage a situation, but the mode of someone who had a case to make and a window to make it in before the other side understood what was coming. Tonight, he said. He walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame. Vance. He didn't turn around. For what it's worth. I've read your reports. All of them. He paused. I should have said something sooner. She didn't answer. He left. Torres looked at Mara. Mara looked at the ceiling. Ranger shifted under Cole's chair, resettled, went still. Outside the window, the blizzard had finally exhausted itself. The sky above Iron Creek was clearing from the west, the storm moving on toward the eastern plains, leaving behind the particular silence of a town under fresh snow. Everything muffled, everything slowed, the world briefly simplified into white and gray and the long, cold exhale of a mountain system releasing pressure. In the morning, the warrants would move. The warehouses would open to people with federal authority and the specific patience of investigators who'd been waiting for the green light. The mayor's office would receive visitors he had not invited. Victor Rusk would pick up a phone and find the other end occupied by a voice that was not the one he'd expected. All of that was coming. But right now, in the recovering quiet of a hospital room in a small Wyoming town, Mara Vance lay still and breathed and let herself, for the first time since the mountain, exist in a moment that wasn't trying to kill her. Cole sat across from her with the dog under his chair and his hands loose between his knees. "You should sleep," he said. "I know," she said. Neither of them moved. She did sleep eventually, not because she wanted to, because her body made the decision for her somewhere around 9 p.m. and simply stopped asking permission. Cole was gone by then. He'd stayed until visiting hours ended, and a nurse with the polite but immovable energy of someone who'd enforced this particular rule 10,000 times had appeared in the doorway, and he'd stood and put on his jacket and looked at Mara in the way of someone filing something away rather than saying goodbye. "Emma's at a neighbor's," he said. "She's fine." "Good," Mara said. He nodded. Ranger stood and stretched and followed him out without looking back, which Mara found, in a way she couldn't entirely explain, more reassuring than most things that had happened today. Torres stayed another hour, sat in the chair and worked through her notebook and asked 3 follow-up questions about the cabin and wrote down Mara's answers, and didn't try to make conversation about anything else. It was exactly the right thing to do, and Mara was grateful for it in the quiet way she was grateful for things she hadn't known she needed. Then the lights in the hall went to their nighttime setting, and the hospital settled into its particular nocturnal register, softer, slower, the specific hush of a building full of people in various states of repair. And Mara closed her eyes and was gone before she finished the thought she'd been forming about Warren Pike. She dreamed about the mountain. Not the shooting, or not only the shooting. She dreamed about the tracks in the snow, the gate hanging open, the feeling of walking up a road that someone had left unlocked for themselves, and that she had entered through a gap in their certainty. She woke at 5:43 a.m. to the sound of her own phone buzzing on the bedside table. Torres. A text message sent at 5:41. Warrants executed at 04:30. Black Pine Warehouses and Pike's office. Call me when you're up. Mara stared at the ceiling for approximately 4 seconds. Then she called. Torres answered on the first ring, which meant she hadn't slept. "Tell me," Mara said. "The warehouses first." Torres's voice had the quality of someone running on coffee and momentum. Federal agents went in with Merrick's people and Holt at 4:30. 3 warehouses, the main facility on Route 9 and 2 auxiliary units off the county road near the North Valley. She paused, and the pause had weight to it. "Mara, they found crates. 47 of them in the main facility alone. Assault pattern rifles, suppressors, high-capacity magazines, and," another pause, "shoulder-fired anti-armor systems, 2 of them, still in factory packaging with the serial numbers removed." The hospital room was very quiet. "Anti-armor," Mara repeated. "Merrick's people think they were moving north toward the Canadian border. There's an existing trafficking network that runs firearms into northern territories. The federal task force has been tracking it for 2 years and couldn't identify the southern supply chain." Torres stopped. "Mara, this wasn't just a regional operation. Black Pine was the southern terminus of something that reaches across the border." Mara closed her eyes, opened them. "Pike. Arrested at 5:15, at his house. He answered the door in a bathrobe and apparently said nothing for 45 seconds while the agent stood on his porch, and then he asked to call his attorney, which they allowed. And then he was transported." Torres's voice dropped slightly. "His assistant, the one whose extension made the call to the burner, she's being interviewed now, voluntarily. She's been with the mayor's office for 9 years, and she's either the best actor in Wyoming or she had no idea what her boss was using her office line for." "He used her extension," Mara said. "Not his own." "Yes." which means he expected the call to be traceable and put her in front of it. Mara felt something cold move through her that wasn't the hospital air. The particular cold of understanding how expendable she'd been to the man who'd ordered her death, and understanding that she wasn't even the first expendable piece in his arrangement. He'd been putting other people in front of himself for years. "Rusk?" she said. Federal agents picked him up at his house at 4:45. He's in Bitterroot County holding with his lawyers already there. He's not talking. Torres paused. But his operations manager is. Name is Gerald Fitch. He's been with Black Pine since it opened, and he apparently decided sometime between the moment the federal agents knocked on his door and the moment he finished reading the search warrant that his loyalty to Victor Rusk had reached its natural limit. What's he giving them? Payment records, route documentation going back 14 months, and communication logs between Rusk and Pike. Torres's voice shifted. Something underneath it that was satisfaction, and something else. Something that was the particular emotion of a person who'd watched a colleague get shot and was now watching the architecture of why begin to come apart. There are 42 documented contacts between Rusk's personal phone and Pike's personal phone over 8 months, including one at 11:58 a.m. yesterday morning. 11:58. Mara had left the station at approximately 11:40. She'd reached the gate at roughly 11:55. The men in the trees had been in position before she reached the structure. 5 minutes. That was the window. Pike had watched her note on her desk, or someone had told him, and he'd called Rusk, and Rusk had called the men already positioned on the mountain, and they'd had 5 minutes to move from wherever they were staged to a firing position with sight lines to the approach road. They'd been prepared. Not scrambled in response, prepared, which meant they'd known someone might come up that road. They'd kept men on the mountain as a contingency. She'd walked into a standing trap. "Mara," Torres's voice pulled her back. "Holt wants you in a debrief this afternoon, as soon as Dr. Reeves clears you for it." A beat. "Merrick will be there. State DA. And 2 people from his office, and a federal liaison from the task force." Another beat, shorter. "It's going to be a long room." Mara looked at her right arm, immobilized. The shoulder underneath the bandaging a dull, persistent ache that she suspected was going to be a dull, persistent ache for several weeks. "I'll be there," she said. "You're in a hospital bed." "I'll be there," she said again. Torres was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yeah, I figured." Dr. Reeves came by at 8, checked the wound, made several observations about it in the detached clinical language doctors used when they were simultaneously impressed by something and disapproving of the circumstances that produced it. "The tissue damage is significant," she said. "You're looking at 6 to 8 weeks of restricted use before we talk about physical therapy. 12 weeks before full range of motion is a realistic goal." She looked at Mara over her clipboard. "And that's the optimistic projection, assuming you don't do anything to stress the repair in the next 2 weeks. "I need to be in a meeting this afternoon," Mara said. Dr. Reeves looked at her for a moment in the way of someone performing a calculation that had a predetermined outcome but felt compelled to run it anyway. "A meeting," she said. "Seated, low stress, no physical activity. A meeting about the thing that put a bullet through your shoulder." "Different room," Mara said. "Much safer." Dr. Reeves put the clipboard down on the end of the bed. "I'm going to tell you that medically, I recommend you stay here through tomorrow. I'm going to tell you that, and then I'm going to watch you not take the recommendation. And then I'm going to make sure you have a sling and a prescription and written discharge instructions that you'll probably read in a car on the way somewhere." "That's accurate," Mara said. "You're lucky the subclavian was untouched." "I know. If it had been 2 centimeters to the left." "I know, Dr. Reeves." The doctor looked at her for one more moment. Then she picked up the clipboard and wrote something on it, and left the room with the brisk, unsentimental efficiency of someone who'd made peace long ago with the fact that patients made their own decisions, and medicine's role was to maximize the quality of those decisions, not control them. The sling arrived 20 minutes later. The discharge paperwork 30 minutes after that. Cole showed up at 10 with coffee and Emma. Mara heard them before she saw them, the particular conversational rhythm of a father and a 7-year-old, which moved in short bursts with unpredictable topic changes and an underlying warmth that had nothing performative about it. Emma came through the door first. She was small for 7, with her father's dark eyes and a red winter coat that had a small tear in the left elbow that had been repaired with what appeared to be mismatched thread, either a rushed repair or the work of someone who didn't care about matching thread, which Mara suspected was Cole. Emma looked at Mara with the direct, unfiltered assessment that children brought to situations adults found complicated. "You got shot," Emma said. "Emma," Cole said from behind her. "That's what happened." "It is," Mara confirmed. "In the shoulder." Emma considered this. "Does it hurt?" "Yes." "Like a lot?" "Like a moderate amount," Mara said. "Less than yesterday." Emma nodded as though this was satisfactory data. She looked around the room, took in the equipment, the window, the sling, and then looked back at Mara with an expression that settled into something more careful than curiosity. "Dad doesn't get hurt," she said. The sentence had a quality to it, not a statement of invulnerability, but something more complicated, the specific way a child described something they needed to be true. Cole set the coffee on the bedside table and didn't say anything. "Your dad helped me not get hurt worse," Mara said. She looked at Emma steadily. "He's the reason I'm in this room instead of somewhere colder." Emma held her gaze. Processing. Then she looked at her father in the doorway, and the expression on her face was something Mara felt she was intruding on, private and complicated and belonging to the two of them, and she looked at her coffee cup instead. Cole crossed the room and pulled the chair close to the bed and sat down. "How's the arm?" he said. "Attached." "Debrief today?" 2 p.m., Sheriff's Department conference room. She looked at him. "Holt wants you there." Cole was quiet for a moment. Emma had moved to the window and was looking out at the snow-covered parking lot with the absorbed attention children brought to ordinary things. "As a witness," Cole said. "As a witness. But Merrick's team is going to ask about your background, the way you handled the cabin." She kept her voice even. "It's going to come out, Cole." He looked at Emma's back. "I know," he said. "Is that a problem?" A pause. Not the pause of someone deciding whether to answer, but the pause of someone measuring the gap between the life they'd built and the thing that was about to ask them to account for it. "It's not a problem," he said. "It's just—" He stopped, started again. "I came here so she could have a normal, so I could be someone's normal dad, and not the other thing." He said it without self-pity, just fact. Once the other thing is in the room, it's harder to put back. Mara looked at him. At the tired lines around his eyes and the careful way he held himself. Not tense, exactly, but contained, like a man who'd learned that stillness was the price of control. "The other thing saved my life," she said. Cole looked at her. "For whatever that's worth to the accounting," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "It's worth something," he said. From the window, without turning around, Emma said, "Is Ranger allowed in hospitals?" "He was yesterday," Mara said. "Dad left him with Mrs. Kowalski today." "Mrs. Kowalski with the cats?" "He doesn't chase them," Emma said, still looking out the window. "He just sits near them. They hate it." Mara looked at Cole. Cole looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man who'd had this conversation before and found it no less exhausting for the repetition. "He retired from active work," Cole said. "He's recalibrating his social skills." "Are you talking about the dog?" Mara said. A pause. "Yes," Cole said. "I'm talking about the dog." The conference room in the Iron Creek Sheriff's Department was not built for 7 people. It had a table that seated 6 comfortably. A whiteboard that hadn't been cleaned since a training session in September left a faded diagram of emergency evacuation routes still visible underneath 3 layers of dry erase residue, a window that faced the parking lot, and a coffee maker that was still broken. At 2 p.m., 8 people were in it, Holt at the head, Torres to his left. Mara across from Torres, in her sling, her coffee, from the hospital in her left hand because the department coffee maker was broken and she hadn't been willing to arrive without caffeine for this particular room. Cole beside her. 2 members of Merrick's state DA team, a man named Rourke, who was mid-40s and wore the specific kind of unremarkable suit that suggested he'd chosen it deliberately, and a younger woman named Park, who had a recording device and a laptop, and the hyper-organized energy of someone who was going to be a problem for defendants for the next 30 years. And across from Rourke and Park, the federal liaison, a task force agent named Devereaux, who had driven up from Cheyenne that morning and still had the particular road-tired look of someone who'd been surviving on gas station coffee since before dawn. Merrick himself was on a video screen at the far end of the table, which meant everyone had to partially angle toward the screen and partially toward each other, and nobody's sightlines were quite right. It was the kind of logistical friction that Mara suspected Merrick had arranged deliberately, though she couldn't have articulated why. Holt opened it. "We're going to go through this in order," he said. "Physical evidence first, then witness accounts, then the investigation history. I want everything on record, and I want this room to understand that the state DA's office is the lead authority on prosecution. My department cooperates fully." Rourke nodded. Park was already typing. Devereaux said, "Before we do the formal sequence, I want to understand the mountain operation. Who was staged up there and for how long?" Holt looked at Mara. Mara said, "The structure on the ridge had been there long enough to have a concrete pad poured. That's weeks minimum, probably months. The men who ambushed me were staged, not scrambled. They had positioning and sight lines established before I arrived, which means Black Pine maintained a security detail on the mountain on an ongoing basis. They weren't responding to me specifically until the phone call." "The 11:58 call," Devereaux said. "Yes, but the men being on the mountain, that was standard procedure for them." Devereaux wrote something. "How many?" "Two that I encountered. There may have been others. I wasn't in a position to do a full assessment." She paused. Cole said, "When I reached Deputy Vance, she'd been moving for approximately 20 minutes since the initial ambush. In that time, the two men had been tracking her rather than establishing a perimeter, which suggests they didn't have additional personnel to set a wider net. 2 is consistent with what was there." Everyone in the room looked at Cole. Devereaux looked at him for a moment longer than the others. "You have a military background, Mr. Mercer?" "Yes." "What branch?" "Navy." "Specifics?" Cole looked at Devereaux evenly. "SEAL Team 3, 7 years active duty, separated 14 months ago." The room was quiet for exactly 2 seconds, the specific silence of several people recalibrating information simultaneously. Rourke said, "That explains the cabin." "It explains some things about the cabin," Cole said. "The rest was improvised." Holt was looking at Cole with the expression of a man who'd been told he was holding a standard playing card and had just turned it over and found it was something else. Not angry, not betrayed. Something closer to the feeling of a puzzle piece that finally made the surrounding pieces make sense. "You didn't mention the SEAL background when you gave your initial statement," Holt said. "You didn't ask." "I'm asking now." "Now you have the answer." Holt looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the table and wrote something on the legal pad in front of him and moved on, which Mara recognized as the move of a man who'd filed something and would return to it later in a different context. Park looked up from her laptop. "Mr. Mercer, were there any communications equipment in the cabin beyond the field radio Deputy Vance used?" "Not that I found. The prisoners had a burner phone. I secured it and passed it to Sheriff Holt upon his arrival." "The phone has been processed," Rourke said. 4 calls, as Deputy Torres reported. 3 to an unregistered number we've now identified as a relay point used by the trafficking network, and the incoming call from Pike's office." He looked at Mara. "Deputy Vance, the testimony you received from the prisoner in the cabin, the one with the leg wound, he named Rusk specifically as the person who gave the order to come up the mountain." "Yes." "And he referenced a contact of Rusk's named Warren." "He heard Rusk use the name in a phone call. He didn't have a last name." Rourke nodded. He looked at his notes. "We now have documentary evidence, the communication logs from Fitch at Black Pine's operations, that confirms the contact is Warren Pike. 42 contacts over 8 months, the most recent at 11:58 yesterday." He paused. "What we need for the prosecution to be clean is to establish that the order given in that call was the order to eliminate you." "The prisoner will testify to the call he received from Rusk," Mara said. "He's already talked once." "We need him to testify specifically about the language used. Then someone needs to have that conversation with him in the next 24 hours before his lawyers finish coaching him on the things he doesn't remember." Rourke looked at her, a small, precise look. "That's our intention." On the screen, Merrick cleared his throat. "I want to spend some time on the investigation history. Deputy Vance..." He looked directly at the camera, which created the particular uncanny experience of a face on a screen appearing to make eye contact. You built a 47-page evidentiary file on Black Pine Freight independently. Walk me through that. Mara walked him through it. It took 23 minutes. She went through the manifest discrepancies she'd found in March, the witness testimony from Ray Cutler at the hunting lodge, the trail camera footage, the cross-referenced tire impressions, the fuel receipt analysis. She went through it in the same systematic, fact-separated from inference structure she'd used when she built the file, because that was how she'd written it, and she didn't see a reason to present it differently. When she finished, Merrick was quiet for a moment. "You built this on your own time," he said, "off-duty." "Some of it, yes, without departmental resources. The trail camera was my own equipment. The rest used public records and department databases that any active deputy has access to." "Sheriff Holt." Merrick looked at Holt on the screen. "Were you aware of this investigation?" Holt said, "I was aware Deputy Vance had an interest in the Black Pine Freight anomalies. I did not know the scope of the file she'd built. He stopped. His jaw moved slightly. "I didn't follow up adequately on what she brought to me." The room held that. Mara looked at the table in front of her. She didn't feel the satisfaction she'd thought she might feel, hearing Holt say it in a room full of people who were writing things down. She felt tired, mostly. And something underneath the tired that was harder to name, the specific feeling of being right about something in a way that had cost considerably more than being right should cost. Park said, "Deputy Vance, do you believe your investigation was impeded by the department?" Mara looked at Park, at the recording device beside her laptop. She thought about 11 months, about traffic stops and school crossings and Rick Stalls eating his sandwich, about Holt's closed door, about the way she'd learned to stop expecting a different kind of recognition around month 4. She thought about a 47-page file built on her own time with her own equipment. "I believe my investigation was not supported," she said carefully. "I don't have evidence that it was actively impeded." "Is there a difference?" "Legally, yes. Practically," she stopped. "Practically, the outcome was similar." Park wrote something. Rourke wrote something. Devereaux was looking out the window. Holt was looking at Mara. She met his gaze. He held it. His face had the quality she'd seen in the hospital room, the quality of a man who'd been making a calculation for 11 months and had received the final accounting and found it unfavorable. Not to the investigation, to himself. He looked away first. The debrief ran until 5:15. By the end of it, 3 things had been established for the record. The evidentiary chain connecting Pike to Rusk to the mountain operation was solid enough that Rourke used the word prosecutable twice without qualifying it. The federal task force was absorbing the Black Pine case into their existing network investigation, which meant resources that dwarfed anything the county or state could deploy. And Cole Mercer's testimony, specific, detailed, credible, and delivered with the particular economy of someone who'd been trained to give accurate accounts under pressure, had been entered into the formal record in a way that meant he was going to have a file with the state DA's office, whether he wanted one or not. After the room cleared, Holt asked Cole to stay. Mara stayed too. She wasn't asked to, and nobody told her to leave, so she stayed in her chair with her left hand around her empty coffee cup and watched. Holt sat across from Cole. Torres was gone. Rourke and Park had packed their equipment and left with the efficient finality of people who had other rooms to be in. Devereaux had shaken everyone's hands with the energy of someone wrapping up a task on a longer list and driven back toward the highway. Just the 3 of them. The broken coffee maker. The half-erased evacuation diagram on the whiteboard. "SEAL Team 3, Holt said. "Yes." 7 years. "Yes." "And you came to Iron Creek to do land management work." "Yes," Cole said. "My daughter needed stability. I needed something quieter." He paused. "I wasn't hiding the background. It just didn't come up." "It came up yesterday." "It did." Holt leaned back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at Cole. "I'm not going to pretend I'm not glad you were on that mountain, or that what you did in that cabin was anything other than exactly right." He paused. "But I need to know if there's anything else about your history here that becomes relevant to what I'm managing." Cole looked at him. "What are you asking?" I'm asking whether a quiet man with a dog and a land management job is the whole story, or whether there's something I'm going to find when I run the deeper check. Cole was quiet for a moment. You're going to find a service record, he said. 7 years, mostly overseas, multiple operational deployments. You're going to find a separation that was honorable. You're going to find that I was married for 5 years and divorced for 2, and that my daughter has been with me full-time for 18 months. He paused. You're going to find that I chose Iron Creek off a map because it had under 5,000 people and was more than 200 miles from the nearest city. That's the whole story. Holt studied him. The separation, he said. Voluntary? Yes. Why? Cole looked at his hands. A long moment. Emma asked me once what I did when I was away. He said it slowly, not reluctant, careful. I told her I kept people safe. She asked if I was safe, and I told her yes, and she said... He stopped. She said she didn't believe me. She was 5. He looked up. She was right. Holt was quiet. So you left, Holt said. So I left. The room held that for a moment. Mara looked at the whiteboard, at the faded evacuation diagram, at the routes drawn on it in someone's hand, neat arrows indicating direction, exits marked with small squares, a map of how to get out of a building in an emergency. Something someone had drawn as an exercise and left there, half erased, the edges blurring into the white. She thought about the file on her laptop at home. 47 pages. Built over 7 months on her own time with her own equipment. Nobody had told her to build it. Nobody had helped her build it. It had existed in the gap between what her department assigned her and what she'd decided the situation required. The same gap Cole had walked into on a mountain when his dog ran toward the sound of rifles. Different people, different backgrounds, the same gap. Holt, she said. Both men looked at her. Victor Rusk's attorneys are going to start building his defense the moment they understand the scope of what Fitch gave up. And Pike's attorneys are already working. She looked at Holt. The prisoner with the leg wound, the one who talked in the cabin. He gave me the name Warren, voluntarily, before lawyers were in the room. She paused. I need to be in the room when the state's team interviews him again. Holt looked at her sling. Rourke's team handles that interview. Rourke's team wasn't in the cabin, I was. She held Holt's gaze. He talked to me because I was there and I was hurt, and I was asking and there was nobody else. That specific situation doesn't reconstruct. But if I'm in the room, there's a continuity to it. He's not starting over with strangers, he's continuing a conversation. Holt thought about it. She watched him think about it, the practical calculation running against whatever residual caution he still had about the 26-year-old deputy with 11 months on the job. I'll talk to Rourke, he said. No guarantees. That's fine, Mara said. She stood up. Her shoulder made itself known. She let it. One more thing, she said. Holt looked at her. Ray Cutler, the man who runs the hunting lodge at the base of the pass. He told me months ago he'd heard engines up on the ridge. She paused. He needs to know he's not in danger anymore. That's not a formal task. It's just someone who was scared and kept his mouth shut and waited to see how this went. She looked at Holt. He could use a phone call. Holt was quiet for a moment. I'll call him, he said. Mara nodded. She picked up her empty coffee cup, habit, something to do with her one functional hand, and walked to the door. She stopped. The note I left on my desk, she said, without turning around. Did Stalls see it? A pause. She heard Holt shift in his chair. Rick Stalls has been on administrative leave since yesterday afternoon, Holt said, pending the investigation into how Pike's office knew your location. Mara stood at the door for a moment. She thought about Rick Stalls eating his sandwich, the single earbud, the way he never looked up when she walked in. She'd never liked him. She hadn't trusted that feeling because she hadn't liked a lot of people here for a long time, and she hadn't wanted her discomfort to be the metric. Okay, she said. She went through the door. Cole was in the hallway. He'd left before the final exchange. She hadn't heard him go, and he was standing near the exterior door with his jacket on and his keys in his hand. Emma's with Mrs. Kowalski until 6, he said. I need to pick her up. Go, Mara said. He looked at her, at the sling, at the empty coffee cup she was still holding for no good reason. He reached over and took it from her hand without asking and set it on the window ledge beside the door. She looked at the cup on the ledge. "Thank you," she said. She meant it to cover more than the cup, and they both understood that. "Yeah," he said. He pushed through the exterior door. Cold air came in before it closed. Mara stood in the hallway of the Iron Creek Sheriff's Department, the building where she'd spent 11 months being careful and small and assigned to the things that didn't matter, and looked at the empty coffee cup on the window ledge. Down the hall, through the bullpen, she could see Rick Stalls's empty desk. The chair pushed in, the surface cleared, like he'd known before he left that he wasn't coming back, or like someone had cleared it for him. She looked at it for a moment. Then she walked to her own desk, sat down in her own chair, opened her laptop with her left hand, and began writing a report. Her name at the top, her badge number, the date, the time, the words, Incident Report. Frostfang Pass, November 14th, followed by the cursor blinking in the quiet of a room that was finally, after 11 months, beginning to feel like it might actually be hers. The report took 3 hours. Not because it was complicated. The facts were clear, the sequence was established, and Mara had been running through the account in her head since she woke up in the hospital, but because she wrote it the way she'd built the original file. Carefully. Every observation attributed to its source, every inference labeled as inference and separated from what she'd directly witnessed. Times, distances, exact wording of conversations she'd been part of. When she finished, it was past 8 p.m. and the bullpen was empty, and the overhead fluorescents were doing the thing they did when the building was quiet. A faint, intermittent hum that she'd never noticed when other people were around. She read it through once, fixed 2 places where the chronology needed tightening, saved it under her badge number and the date, and submitted it through the department system, which sent it automatically to Holt's inbox and, per the protocol Rourke's team had established that afternoon, to a shared folder accessible to the state DA's office. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at Rick Stalls's empty desk for a while. She'd worked next to that desk for 11 months. She knew the sound of his chair when he leaned back in it. She knew the specific way he ate, the sandwich always from the same paper bag, the same deliberate pace, like a man who decided eating was a task to be completed rather than experienced. She knew that when the radio went active on something that required response, there was a half-second delay between the call and his movement. Not laziness, she'd thought, just the particular pace of someone comfortable in the knowledge that their position was secure. He'd been on administrative leave for 6 hours. She didn't know yet what he'd done exactly, whether he'd seen the note and called someone or texted, or whether he'd done nothing at all and the trail ran through someone else in the building. Holt's people were working through it. Rourke's team was involved. The truth of Rick Stalls's specific role in the chain that had sent 2 men up a mountain after her would emerge in documentation and interviews over the next few days, and she'd read it in an official report rather than sitting across from him at a desk. That was fine. She didn't need to sit across from him. She'd already sat across from the consequences of whatever he'd done, in a cabin at 9,000 feet with a bullet in her shoulder and 2 armed men walking through the tree line. She turned off her monitor, collected her jacket. The right sleeve hung empty over the sling, which she'd been managing awkwardly all day, and walked out through the front door of the Iron Creek Sheriff's Department into the cold night air. The parking lot was quiet. The town was quiet in the specific way of a place that had weather move through it and was now processing the aftermath. Snow piled against the curbs, the road surface packed and gray, the storefronts on Main dark, except for the diner, which was always the last light in Iron Creek on weekday evenings. She stood on the front step for a moment. The sky was clear. After 2 days of storm, the kind of clear that only happened in winter at altitude, absolute, depthless, the stars not decorative but present in a way that felt almost aggressive, more of them than any sky should hold. She looked at them for a moment. Then she walked to her truck, which Torres had driven down from the gate on Frostfang Pass that afternoon, and drove home. The 6 weeks that followed were not quiet in any meaningful sense, but they had a different quality of noise than the days on the mountain and in the hospital. A procedural, institutional noise that moved through conference rooms and courtrooms and official channels rather than through frozen trees and abandoned cabins. Warren Pike was arraigned on the 3rd day. He appeared in Bitterroot County District Court in a charcoal suit that his attorney had clearly selected and stood at the defendant's table with the particular stillness of a man who had decided that composure was his last asset and intended to spend it carefully. His attorney entered a not guilty plea. The judge set bail at a figure high enough to keep him in county lockup, while the case developed, citing flight risk given the federal scope of the charges. Mara wasn't in the courtroom for the arraignment. She was in physical therapy, 45 minutes away in Bitterroot, doing exercises that her therapist described as progressive and that she described privately as extraordinarily unpleasant. Her right arm had the range of motion of something borrowed from a much older person, and the process of reclaiming it was slow and unglamorous, and nothing like what she'd expected recovery to feel like. She went 3 times a week. She did the exercises at home on the days between. She was not a patient. She knew this about herself within the first week. But she did the work because not doing it had an outcome she found unacceptable. Victor Rusk's attorney attempted to negotiate a cooperation agreement in the second week. Merrick's office declined the initial terms. Gerald Fitch, the operations manager who'd opened the door on Black Pine's records, was already cooperating under a separate agreement, and the federal task force was building its case against the Northern Network using Fitch's documentation rather than anything Rusk could offer. Rusk's leverage, it turned out, was considerably lower than his attorney had assessed. The negotiation continued. Rick Stalls resigned in the 3rd week. Mara heard it from Torres over the phone. Stalls had submitted a letter to Holt and walked out of the building, and that was the last Iron Creek Sheriff's Department contact with him. The investigation into his specific role was still ongoing, but what had emerged was this. He had photographed Mara's note on his phone and sent the image to a number that traced back to the municipal offices. Not to Pike directly, to the same assistant's extension that had forwarded it to Pike, who had then called Rusk. A chain with enough links in it that Stalls' attorney was arguing his client hadn't understood what he was facilitating. Mara read the investigative summary. She read it once, in her kitchen, with coffee. Then she put it face down on the table and sat for a while. She'd worked next to that desk for 11 months. She hadn't liked him. She'd dismissed that feeling because she hadn't wanted to trust it. She picked up the summary and filed it in the folder she was keeping. Not the working folder, the closed one. The one that was building its own archive of how this had gone. Davis Carver came forward in the 3rd week. He'd been sitting on his photographs for 10 days after the warrants, waiting, his grandmother said later, for the situation to be stable enough that coming forward felt like contribution rather than exposure. Helen had known about the photos for days before Davis called Rourke's office. She'd known, and she'd waited with him, in the specific way that people who love someone let them come to the right decision without pushing. When Davis met with Rourke's team, he brought his phone and a printed set of images and the measured, precise account of what he'd seen and how he'd seen it. The photograph of the open truck panel, the cascade of brass cartridges catching the morning light, had the kind of clarity that made it immediately useful, not just evidentiary but illustrative, the kind of image that would read clearly to a jury that had never thought much about ballistic fragments found in Wyoming wildlife. The fragments Helen had preserved in specimen jars matched the ammunition in the warehouse images. A forensic analysis confirmed it in the 4th week. The wildlife evidence, the pronghorn, the mule deer, the pattern of incidental discharge along the freight route, became part of the federal evidentiary package in a way that nobody had anticipated when an elderly veterinarian had decided to keep a bullet fragment instead of throwing it away. Helen came to see Mara in the 4th week. Not about the case, that had moved well beyond anything either of them could directly affect. She came to the station on a Tuesday morning with a plate of something she'd baked and set it on the counter, and looked at Mara's arm in the sling with the evaluating eye of someone who'd spent decades assessing the recovery trajectories of damaged living things. "How's the shoulder?" she said. "Better than last week," Mara said. "Worse than I'd like." Helen nodded. "Davis wants to meet you. He's been—" She paused. "He feels responsible for not coming forward sooner." "He came forward when it was useful," Mara said. "The timing worked. Tell him that." "I will." Helen looked at her for a moment with the particular look of someone who'd lived long enough to recognize a certain kind of person on sight. "You're not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" Helen considered it. "Someone older," she said. Not unkindly, just honest. Mara almost laughed. The closest she'd come in a while. "I get that a lot." Helen patted the plate on the counter and left. Mara looked at the plate, something with what appeared to be apples and brown sugar, and then at the empty chair across from her desk where Helen had briefly sat, and thought about a woman who'd kept bullet fragments in specimen jars for 3 weeks out of an instinct that something was wrong and had been right, and had said nothing until she had someone to say it to. Different people, different angles. The same instinct that something underneath the ordinary surface of this town had been built on rot. She pulled the plate toward her and found a fork in her desk drawer. The formal commendation came in the 5th week. Holt called her into his office and handed her a letter on state letterhead signed by Merrick and 2 members of the governor's office, which named her specifically in the investigation's resolution. She read it once while Holt stood by his desk. "There's also this," Holt said. He handed her a second document, her personnel file open to the evaluation section. She looked at it. The last entry was from 2 months ago, standard language. Deputy Vance continues to demonstrate proficiency in assigned duties. Areas for development, initiative in complex case environments. Holt had a pen in his hand. "I'm amending the evaluation," he said. "Today's date. It goes in the file and it goes in the state record." He paused. "I can read you what I'm writing, or I can just write it." "Just write it," she said. He wrote it. She didn't read over his shoulder. When he was done, he closed the file and set it on his desk and looked at her. "I owe you more than a commendation letter and a corrected evaluation," he said. "I know that." "Graham, let me finish." He stopped her without raising his voice. "I made a calculation about how to manage the investigation, and that calculation put you in a position where you were working without support in a situation that required it. I was trying to protect the case, and I didn't protect you. And those 2 things should not have been in conflict, and they were because of decisions I made." He held her gaze. "I'm telling you that on the record, not just in this room." Mara looked at him, at the tired lines that had been in his face since the hospital and hadn't left, at the gray at his temples that seemed more pronounced than it had been 6 weeks ago, which was possibly just the light, but possibly wasn't. "Okay," she said. "That's all you've got? What do you want me to say?" He almost smiled. "Nothing, probably. You're not the type." He looked at the file on his desk. "There's something else. The state is expanding the regional investigation unit. 6 counties, task force structure, resources Bitterroot couldn't assemble independently. Merrick's office asked me if I had anyone to recommend for a field investigator position." He looked at her steadily. "It's not a promotion in the traditional sense. It's a lateral move, but with broader jurisdiction and a different reporting structure. Your work wouldn't run through this department anymore." He paused. "I recommended you." Mara said nothing for a moment. "You recommended me for a position that takes me out of your department." "Yes." "Why?" Holt looked at the window, at the parking lot, at the town beyond it, the rooftops still white from the season's accumulated snow, the streets quiet in the mid-morning way of a place that ran at its own pace and always had. "Because you're better than what I've been giving you to do," he said. It came out flat and honest and cost him something. She could tell. "And because you've earned the right to work somewhere that knows that before you have to prove it." The room was quiet. Mara looked at the commendation letter in her left hand, at the state seal at the top, at her name in the middle of the text, correct and official, and finally occupying a document that matched what she'd actually done rather than what she'd been assigned to do. "When do they need an answer?" she said. 2 weeks. She nodded. "I'll think about it. That's all I'm asking." She stood. She set the letter on his desk. She'd get a copy from the file. She didn't need to carry it out like a trophy. She walked to the door. "Holt," she said. He looked up. "Ray Cutler. Did you call him?" A pause. Something moved in his face that was brief and human. "First thing the morning after," he said. He cried a little. "Don't tell him I told you." Mara nodded. She went back to her desk. Cole's formal witness obligation concluded in the 5th week. Rourke's team had scheduled 2 additional interviews after the initial debrief, and Cole had attended both with the same measured, organized account-giving that had characterized the first, and at the end of the second interview, Rourke had shaken his hand and told him the state appreciated his cooperation and that his testimony would be important to the prosecution. Cole had nodded and collected Ranger from the hallway where the dog had been waiting and driven home. What had also happened in that 5th week, less formally, his background had become known in Iron Creek. Not broadly, not the way things became known in towns where someone decided to be interesting about information. more the way truth moved in small communities when it stopped being secret, gradually, with a quality of recognition rather than revelation, as if people felt they'd known something like it all along and were now being given the language for it. The soccer parents, mostly. One of the fathers, a man named Torres, no relation to Keisha, who ran the hardware store on Main, had stopped Cole in the parking lot after practice and said simply, "My brother was in the Corps. I heard what you did up there." He'd extended his hand. Cole had shaken it. Neither of them had said anything else, and that had been, somehow, the right amount. Emma had heard something at school, from Clara, who'd heard it from her mother, who'd heard it from someone at the hardware store. Emma had come home and sat at the kitchen table while Cole made dinner and said, with the particular precision she brought to questions she'd been constructing internally for a while, "Did you fight people on the mountain?" Cole had kept his eyes on the pan. "I helped a deputy who was hurt." "Clara said you fought people." There was some of that. Emma was quiet for a moment. Cole had learned, over 7 years of her, that her silences were not empty. They were processing time, and interrupting them produced worse outcomes than waiting. "Were you scared?" she said. He thought about it. He didn't give her the automatic answer. "A little," he said. "After. While it was happening, I was mostly just busy." Emma considered this. "Is the deputy okay?" "She's getting better." "Is she nice?" Cole turned the burner down. "Yeah," he said. "She's decent." Emma nodded. She picked up her fork and looked at her plate, and then looked up with the expression that meant there was one more thing. "Ranger helped too?" "Ranger helped a lot." Emma looked at Ranger under the table. Ranger looked back at her with the dignified, slightly put-upon expression he reserved for being observed during meals. "Good boy," Emma said. Ranger's tail moved once against the floor. Then he put his head back on his paws. The morning Mara went back to Frostfang Pass was a Saturday in late January. The season had shifted slightly. Not warm, not anywhere near warm, but a different quality of cold from November. The kind that was dry rather than wet, that came with clear air and flat white light rather than the churning gray of the storm season. The kind of cold that made the mountains look like something cut from paper against the sky. She'd been cleared for full duty 4 days earlier. Her arm was out of the sling. The range of motion wasn't complete yet. She still couldn't raise the right arm fully above her head without discomfort, and her physical therapist had made her promise to continue the exercises for another 6 weeks. But she was functional. She was back. She hadn't been up to the pass since the helicopter evacuation in November. She'd thought about it several times during recovery, and each time she'd let the thought pass without acting on it. Not avoidance. She'd examined it carefully enough to be certain it wasn't pure avoidance. More like waiting. Waiting for the right state of the situation, internal and external. The external state had settled. Pike was in custody awaiting trial, the date set for March. Rusk had finally accepted a cooperation agreement. Merrick had described the terms as satisfactory, in the specific tone that meant the terms were favorable to the prosecution, and Rusk had run out of alternatives. Fitch's cooperation had been central and would continue to be. The 2 men from the cabin, Leg Wound and the other one, whose actual name turned out to be Derek Salter, were facing federal charges that would take years to work through the system. Salter had stopped talking. Leg Wound, whose name was Paul Kessler, had continued the conversation he'd started on the cabin floor, and was now the kind of witness prosecutors described as cooperative and defense attorneys described as problematic. The access road into Frostfang Pass was still technically restricted. The gate had a new lock. County maintenance had resecured it 2 weeks after the warrants. Mara had the key, the same key the department had always had, the key that someone had duplicated for Black Pine Freight. And that had started the whole chain of things she was still untangling. She drove to the gate, unlocked it, drove through and resecured it behind her. The road was packed snow over ice, passable but slow. She drove with both hands and took the switchbacks carefully and didn't push the truck. She hadn't told anyone she was coming up here. She'd considered telling Torres and decided against it. This wasn't a departmental thing. It didn't require backup. It was just a morning and a road and a place she needed to stand in while it was not trying to kill her. The structure was gone. She'd known it would be. Federal evidence teams had dismantled it in the weeks after the warrants, removed the concrete pad and the prefabricated walls and the surveillance equipment, leaving a flattened area of disturbed earth now covered in snow. It looked like nothing now, A cleared space in the trees, slightly off-grade, the kind of thing that would be invisible in 3 years when the undergrowth came back. She stood at the edge of the clearing and looked at it. The pine tree she'd gone down against was still there. She found it without difficulty, recognized it from the bark pattern, from the angle of the low branches, from the specific way it sat relative to the tree line. There was nothing visible in the snow around it, nothing left over. The storm had been thorough. She stood at the base of the tree for a moment. She thought about what she'd felt, going down against it. The specific quality of that moment, not the fear which had been present but hadn't been the loudest thing. The loudest thing had been something closer to clarity, the kind you got when the unnecessary parts of a situation fell away, and what remained was very simple. This is where I am, this is what I have, this is what I need to do next. She'd had that feeling in the cabin too, and in the hospital, and in the conference room with Rourke and Merrick and Holt. The same clarity, scaled to different stakes, requiring different tools. She was still carrying the same tools. Footsteps behind her. She turned. Cole came through the tree line from the east, Ranger ahead of him, the dog moving through the snow with the deliberate pace of a working animal, managing his hips on a cold morning. Cole had his hands in his jacket pockets and snow on his boots, and the specific expression of a man who was not surprised to find her here. "Torres told me," he said. "I didn't tell Torres." She guessed. She texted me. He stopped beside her, looked at the cleared space where the structure had been. Said she figured you'd go up here on a Saturday. Mara looked at the space. She guessed right. She usually does, apparently. Ranger came to Mara's side and pushed his head against her left hand. She put her palm on his head the way she'd done in the cabin, on the floor, while the fire worked and the storm hammered the walls. The three of them stood in the quiet. "I got offered a position," Mara said. "Regional Investigation Unit, multi-county. Merrick's task force structure." Cole said nothing, waiting. "It would mean leaving the department, technically. Different chain of command." She paused. "Broader jurisdiction. More complex cases." She looked at the cleared space. "More black pines." "Is that what you want?" She thought about it. The real version of thinking about it, not the performative consideration. "Yes," she said. "I think it is." She paused. "It's also—" She stopped. "What?" "It's also terrifying." She said it evenly, not asking for reassurance, just stating it. "I've spent 11 months proving I can do the job that nobody let me do. This is a different job. Bigger stakes, different risks, different ways to be wrong." She looked at him. "I might not be good at it." Cole looked at the tree line for a moment. "You walked up a mountain alone with 47 pages of evidence you'd built on your own time," he said, "with no backup and no support and no guarantee anyone would ever take it seriously." He paused. "You were terrified then, too." "How do you know?" "Because you were smart enough to be." She looked at him. The flat winter light caught the angles of his face, the tiredness, the particular quality of stillness he carried everywhere. He didn't look like a man who'd taken down 2 armed men in a cabin. He looked like a man who'd picked up his daughter from school and made dinner and put the dog out before bed and would do all of it again tomorrow. "What about you?" she said. He looked at her. "They're going to want to talk to you," she said. "Merrick's people. The federal task force. You know things about operational patterns that are relevant to the Northern Network. The way those men moved, the way they staged, that's information with context that most people in this investigation don't have." She held his gaze. "They're going to ask." Cole was quiet for a long moment. Ranger moved away from them both and stood at the edge of the clearing, looking into the trees with the patient attention of an old working dog who still found the world interesting. "I left for Emma," Cole said. That was the truth. It was also, he stopped. "It was also because I wasn't sure, after 7 years, how much of what I'd done was something I wanted to account for." He said it without drama. The way people said things they'd been carrying long enough to say clearly. "Not legally, morally, whether I was still—" He paused. "Whether I was still the right shape to be her father." Mara was quiet. "You've been her father this whole time," she said. "Whatever shape that took." "I know." He looked at the cleared space. "I know that now more than I did 6 weeks ago." "What changed?" He thought about it. "I did a thing that mattered," he said. "And I did it here, not there, Not in some other country, in a context I can barely explain to most people. He paused. Emma knows what happened on the mountain. She knows what I did. She asked me if I was scared, and I told her the truth, and she said—" He stopped, almost smiled. Not quite. She said, "Okay." And then she asked about Ranger. Mara looked at Ranger at the edge of the clearing. "What did you tell the federal task force?" she said. "I told them I was available for consultation," Cole said, "that I wasn't looking for a formal role, that I had a daughter and a dog and a land management job that I intended to keep." He paused. "They said they'd be in touch. That's going to mean something eventually." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "Emma and I had a conversation about it," she said. Another pause, another almost smile. "She said if I help people and come home, that's okay." Mara looked at him. 7 years old, he said. "She's something," Mara said. "Yes," he said. "She really is." They stood there for a while longer. No particular reason. The cold was manageable, the light was flat and clean, and the mountain was doing what mountains did in January, existing at a scale that made everything else feel appropriately sized. Mara looked at the ridge above the clearing, the one she'd seen from below during the run through the trees, dark against the storm sky, the thing she'd been running toward when the storm swallowed her tracks. She'd looked at that ridge and thought she was going to die below it. It looked different now. Not smaller, it was still a ridge, still rock and snow and evergreen in the proportions that made the Rockies what they were, but different in the way that places looked different when you'd survived them, when they'd become past instead of present. She'd have to make the call to Merrick's office on Monday. She'd been sitting with the question for a week, and it had already settled. She'd known within a day which way she was going to go, and had been giving herself the week to confirm it rather than to decide it. Holt had been right. She was better than what she'd been given to do. The work was there. The scope was there. The part of her that had built 47 pages in her own time on her own equipment wasn't going to stop, because someone finally gave her the official version of the assignment. Monday. She'd call Monday. Ranger came back from the edge of the clearing and stood between them. "You know what's funny?" Mara said. Cole looked at her. "I used to practice what I'd say to Holt. When he finally saw the file. When he finally—" She stopped. "I had this whole thing about being underestimated, about being kept at the periphery. I was going to be very precise about it." She paused. "And then it didn't matter. By the time we got to that room, it had already happened, and what mattered was what came next." Cole looked at the ridge. "That's usually how it works," he said. "I know." She looked at her right hand, flexed it once. The motion was clean, almost full now. "It's annoying." Cole did smile that time, brief and real, and the first time she'd seen it without something pressing from every direction. "Come on," she said. She walked back toward the road. Ranger went with her, matching her pace. Cole followed. They came out of the trees and onto the access road, where Mara's truck and Cole's truck were parked side by side, and the gate was locked behind them, and the valley below was visible through a gap in the ridge. Iron Creek, small and white from here. The buildings barely distinguishable from the landscape around them. A place that had looked a certain way for a long time and was now, quietly, in the middle of becoming something else. The trial was coming. The work was coming. The phone call to Merrick's office was coming on Monday. Physical therapy twice a week until March. And a case file that would be an active prosecution for 2 years at minimum, and a department that would have to figure out who it was without Pike's money and Stalls's particular brand of passive corruption shaping its culture. All of that was coming. But first there was this. A clear January morning, the ridge still above them, the town still below. 3 survivors on a road that had been used for the wrong things and had now stopped being used for them. Mara looked back once at the pass. She wasn't afraid of it. She wasn't not afraid of it. She was something more accurate than either. She was familiar with it, the way you became familiar with a thing you'd survived. It was a mountain, and she had been up it, and what had happened there had happened, and she was still standing on the right side of it. That was enough. She unlocked her truck and got in. Cole and Ranger went to Cole's truck. The engine started up with the particular reluctance of vehicles in January cold, and then settled. Mara pulled out first. Cole followed. They drove down through the switchbacks and out through the gate, which Mara locked behind them, and onto the county road that ran back toward Iron Creek. The town came up in the windshield like it always did, slowly at first, just the water tower and the church steeple visible above the tree line, and then the grid of streets, and the familiar intersection at Main and Birch, and the diner's sign. She drove through it, past the sheriff's department, past Helen Carver's veterinary clinic on the corner, past the elementary school, closed and quiet on a Saturday, the playground equipment standing empty in the snow. She drove to the end of Main where the road widened and turned back toward the highway, and she stopped at the intersection, and she sat there for a moment with her hands on the wheel and the heat running and the town of Iron Creek behind her in the mirror. She'd arrived here 11 months ago as someone everyone had already decided was temporary, a placeholder, a badge that would learn its place or move on. She was still here. Everything that had wanted her gone was gone instead. She put the truck in gear and drove. The people who counted you out before you started were never really counting you. They were counting themselves. What you do with that gap between their arithmetic and your actual worth is the only thing that was ever really yours to decide.